In the annals of history, few topics have captivated the human imagination and stirred profound questions as fervently as the origins of Christianity. Robyn Faith Walsh, a scholar of religious history and an ardent seeker of truth, stands as a beacon guiding us through the intricate labyrinth of historical narratives, spiritual revelations, and ancient mysteries that shape the foundations of one of the world's most influential religions. As we embark on a journey to unravel the true origins of Christianity, we turn to Robyn Faith Walsh as our knowledgeable guide and insightful interpreter of the complex tapestry that underlies the Christian faith. With unwavering dedication and a profound respect for historical accuracy, Robyn has spent years meticulously researching and sifting through the layers of time to reveal the hidden truths that have long been obscured by myths, legends, and the sands of time. In this exploration of Christianity's beginnings, we will follow Robyn Faith Walsh's footsteps as she shines a light on the enigmatic figures, the pivotal events, and the cultural context that shaped the emergence of this global religion. With her expertise, we will delve deep into the archives of history, piecing together the mosaic of beliefs, practices, and ideologies that paved the way for the Christian faith to blossom and spread across the world. Join us as we embark on an illuminating quest, guided by the wisdom and scholarship of Robyn Faith Walsh, to uncover the true origins of Christianity. In her capable hands, we will navigate the complex terrain of ancient civilizations, religious movements, and the transformative power of faith, seeking to understand the origins of a belief system that has left an indelible mark on human civilization.
Okay, we are live, and this is MythVision Podcast. I'm really excited about today's episode because who isn't? Who doesn't want to know who wrote the Gospels? I mean, there are so many debates going on, and the guest I have today is Dr. Robyn Faith Walsh. Welcome to MythVision.
Thank you. It's nice to be back.
It is. I'm always a pleasure to interview you. You are just a very interesting scholar who takes an approach on the Gospels unlike most that I've seen. If I may introduce you just briefly, I won't give the whole Bible of your background, but to give people a tease, you are the associate professor at the University of Miami, UM. She earned her PhD at Brown University in Religions of the Ancient Mediterranean with a focus on early Christianity, ancient Judaism, and Roman archaeology. So there's a lot more here, of course, that you actually have. I just don't want to waste too much time because honestly, I have only so much time with you, and I'm sure we'll have plenty of questions and such. So if we can, we'll get the intro started and then deep dive into the content. We are MythVision. Welcome back. Dr. Walsh, did you notice anything about that intro?
Well, it's different from the last one. There were no dragons.
I almost want to tease you again here. You're in it.
I noticed. I was under Goodacre. I looked.
No, even better. Even better. The 4 horsemen that come, you're the one on the far right.
I'm a horseman?
You are a horseman. You earned it. I have Elaine Pagels is on one side. and you're on the other, and then I have Dr. Robin Price, Dennis R. McDonald.
Okay, so I've now reached the pinnacle of my career. That's it. That's the top.
You can retire now.
Yeah, I'm for my second act.
I almost want to play it just to show you that one part real quick. Let's do it one more time real quick. Here we go. Okay, there you go.
I'm so excited. Can you please send me
I will actually send you a still, and I'll send you the video itself.
All right, I'm going to take it on my social media. That's
absolutely. Yeah, you've got the MythVision Sith over there.
Yeah, love it.
You're the I think I'd say you're the Horseman of Death in this one. You're bringing the role. Well, thank you so much.
Understand me.
I'm trying to,
Yeah.
Bringing death to fundamentalism. Seriously, welcome back. I'm excited. Everybody in the chat, there's so much love in the chat right now for you. We're really excited to see where the conversation goes. The last time you did a presentation,
right?
And I want everybody to see real quick. So obviously her website, robynfaithwalsh.com. Go check out the website. Get her book. This is the groundbreaking, I'm going to really blow your mind book that's going to talk about really the gospel authors. It takes a new approach that, unlike what you typically hear, that is a traditional approach. I think you would call that the romanticism approach that we typically see in scholarship. Elites, let's just call it what it is. People who are sophisticated writers are behind what we see the gospels, behind what we see as the gospels. And we'll be getting into that today. So get you a copy if you can afford it. If you can afford it. I know it's expensive. What do we do about that, Robyn? I know there's nothing.
Well, I'll say that I do worry about that. And I probably shouldn't say anything about it, but I do think it's a bit expensive, but it's a university press, and that tends to be the case. Mm-hmm. I'm hoping future books, I'll look for presses that are more affordable. So I can tell you that when I sign the contract, at some point it will go into paperback if it sells a certain number of copies. So hopefully, this kind of price, I think, the more I understand about publishing, is designed for libraries to purchase it and to put it on their shelves where they have more funds. And so if that happens, enough books sell to libraries and that sort of thing, and to academics who maybe have some funding to supplement this kind of thing, it will eventually go paperback. And I hope that will be more.
So my recommendation for those who don't have the income to afford it, I understand, go to the local library, recommend it. If they don't have it, they will get it. They'll purchase it, and they will make sure you get a copy. This book was fabulous. The episode we did last time went almost 60,000 views. I mean, everything you thought you knew about the Gospels is wrong, meaning we need to approach it completely different than what we have. And then, of course, I notify my patrons when I have lives coming up. I try to let them know early now. I'm trying to do that. It won't always be that way. Sometimes I'm spontaneous, but I do a lot of work on here. And if you've considered wanting to help us, you could do so for as little as $3 a month to get in the door. Promised no damnation. You will not end up in Gehenna. This is it's indulgences. You won't go to hell. So please consider helping support us. Seriously. The first question is a big question, and that is, who wrote the Gospels?
Well, there's the traditional line on this, which I think most people are familiar with, and it tends to take two tracks. One is this idea that because they're named after Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, and these happen to be names that are also found in the Gospels, that these must be the testimonies of the people who were actually around Jesus during his lifetime and witnessed all of the events chronicled in the Gospels themselves. What we do know, and this is less controversial, I think these days, especially within scholarship, is that these texts were initially anonymous, the Gospels, insofar as whether they were written intentionally to be anonymous, or whether we just lost the attribution at some point. It was in later centuries, in the 2nd century and beyond, that names were put onto these Gospels, mostly in some respects as to help scribes so that they didn't get confused. If you're running around with these texts and they don't have an attribution on them, it can be difficult to remember, was this one or that. So eventually some names were put on them, Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, using names that they found in the texts themselves to help demarcate them. And that was a common practice in antiquity. That happened all the time. So that wasn't necessarily a unique thing that happened for the Gospels. So in that case, when there's an awareness that they're anonymous and names were put on them later, sometimes people, Richard Bauckham is a scholar who, for example, supports this view that maybe this still is the eyewitness testimony of the individual in question, the gospel writer in question, but just written down much later. So maybe it's been transported through some kind of oral tradition over the generations until someone who had the literate skill to write it down wrote it down. So that's basically the traditional story. What I've argued in the book that you just mentioned is that actually doesn't make a lot of sense historically for a few reasons. And we can get into that a little bit more in conversation if you like. But the problem is not so much oral tradition theory in and of itself. I don't have a huge problem with oral tradition theory. I think it's interesting. I think as a scholar, it's difficult for me to be able to tell you this was oral, this was not. Right. When something is in prose. If something is a song or it's in verse, it's a little bit easier to say, like, okay, this might have been transported, orally over the generate, right? But when something is just verse, and also in the case of the Gospels, you have the problem of translation. Jesus, we know, the historical Jesus spoke Aramaic, and the Gospels were written in Greek in the first instance, to the best of our knowledge. So these can't be the exact words, that there's some act of translation and some transmission problems with the idea that these are the exact words of Jesus, coupled with the fact that a lot of the events in the Gospels themselves appear elsewhere in other kinds of Greco-Roman literature. And we know genre was very different, writing practices were very different in the ancient world. Most likely, and I actually think historically most likely, the people who wrote the Gospels were more elite than we imagine. These were not the illiterate fishermen who followed Jesus around. These were, with literacy being so low in the ancient world, these were probably people who had much more education, who were, we might consider a higher rung of society, although people who were enslaved could also be literate. So when I say elite, I don't mean they had a lot of money necessarily. They may have. But I mean people who had the means and ability, for whatever reason, despite social standing, to be able to go to school long enough to learn to read and write at a pretty high level, which was about 4% maybe of the population. We can quibble with numbers. So if someone was more elite and educated in Greco-Roman literature broadly and aware of genre restrictions in antiquity, they would have done exactly what I think we find in the Gospels, which is kind of fill in the blanks with tropes and sayings and events and other points of interest that were known to be popular in the first century, second century. So stories like I mentioned the last time I was here, the widow of Ephesus story that you find in the Satyricon, which was about 3 crucified men and a Roman soldier guarding a tomb. And then after 3 days and 3 nights, he realizes a body was stolen off the cross, there was an empty tomb, like all of those themes, even the theme of the empty tomb, are things that would have indicated to a reader like, oh, he became a god now, right? But this was not something you only found in the Gospels. So I argue that the Gospel writers were more elite. So I say elite literate cultural producers, to use fancy language from, sociology. But they were just more elite than we imagine. They probably knew some stories, maybe knew some Christians, but mostly when they wrote this story, they wrote it like a normal Greco-Roman author would, filling in the blanks with data that they saw elsewhere through their education as an elite cultural producer.
There's so many interesting points that you bring up, and the last presentation, the Satyricon, was hilarious. I do have a question. So we have some super chats, right? This is new to you. You've never done a live with me, and we're hanging out, so no pressure. If you get it wrong, it's only heaven or hell, right? I'm just kidding. But seriously, no pressure. We have some super chats. I have a question right now from my friend Jonathan Sheffield, who's making me another intro. one of those cartoon intros. He made that intro, by the way, making you a horseman.
Excellent.
Yeah. So my buddy Jonathan Sheffield, in the vein of what we just said, he says, I said, question from a friend. If the disciples of Jesus are not the authors of the Gospels, but these documents were instead written by well-educated Greeks outside of Palestine, then please explain why well-educated Greeks would write in Koine with smatterings of Aramaic instead of Attic or Alexandrian Greek.
It's a really, really good question, and it's one that puzzles scholars a lot. I'm working on a book right now that actually gets at that exact question. So the person asking this question should be in the field. I think, if I could say so myself, I think it's a great question. There is a rising class of literature in the imperial period that right now I tend to think is actually a little bit in response to the fact that the empire is established. And so things like trade are more possible. And even though you can't quite say there's a middle class in antiquity, there's definitely what I might call an aspirational class. So these would be people who aren't part of the native aristocracy. So say they're not Roman senators and they're not going to inherit like a title, right? And have like a big estate that's like established for themselves. But maybe they're like a merchant in Ostia who they're doing well in like the fish paste trade or something like that. And so they want to engage in the kind of activities that they see as representative of the more economically elite. So things like literate practices, but there's a ceiling there because a Roman senator is not going to hobnob with somebody who's an uneducated but like wealthy merchant necessarily. But that person might say send their son to school to become educated, and that person may reach a certain level of what's called paideia, ancient education. Or they might want to say, we can produce our own literature. We don't need to do this high classicizing style that's representative of these elites, who don't let us traverse that kind of social gap. Mm-hmm. And so what we see in the 1st and 2nd century, there's a scholar named David Constant, who's a classicist, who's written about this, and he calls it the active reader. And so he says that there's an active reader, particularly in the 2nd century. And we know that these active readers existed because things like the ancient Greek novels are starting to be written in a very similar way. So you do have this new Koine presentation of different kinds of literature, and it even includes things like cookbooks and stuff like that you didn't quite see before. But there's clearly a class of people who are, you might not call them literate, not all of them are highly literate, but they're interested in literate practices. They're interested in engaging in these things and producing literature, but either by means they can't quite get to the level of a Virgil or something but they can't write Homeric Greek. But they can try their hand at something that's more familiar to them, something like Koine, and it's going to travel a lot easier around the ancient world in some ways because it's going to be a little bit more accessible, which is why I think someone like Paul, that's his go-to, right? I know he's not writing literature, but when he writes his letters, he's just writing in Koine as well. So I think that you have a little bit of evidence there of what I would call an aspirational class. And so for various reasons, they're embracing that kind of, you might call it dialect, in Greek to communicate stories that are not part of what that truly elite class is interested in at that time.
Interesting. Thank you for that. I really appreciate it. So now we're going to get into some super chats. These are the questions from the common folk. These are not quite the Virgils, but some of them might sound like the Virgils, and then some of them might be just below that. Very rarely do we find fishermen who are commenting in the super chats. So just so you're aware, you might see a different level of question caliber, if you will. And I ask that anyone who is sending in a question or a super chat be respectful. I won't tolerate anything rude or anything like that. Just a heads up. Anyway, Doc Pleuromonaut, thank you for the super chat, my friend. Could it be that Mark avoided theoretical text status and survived because it was a familiar, good, short, and folky story that's easily transmitted orally to diverse groups even after committed to writing?
So yes, sure. I think that that's definitely one possibility. I have to say, I just want to be careful in anything that I propose here. It's just really just kind of a theory that is an educated theory, but one that, I'm often still just testing out myself. That's the interesting thing about the field, because, so many of us have different theses about what could be going on. And I think that that's quite possible. The thing with Mark, though, two things. One is that I think we've lost a little bit, and maybe this is clearer when you translate it from the Greek, but maybe this particular person knows Greek. There's a lot of, I would almost call it, I think I might have even said this to you before, Twilight Zone aspects to the Gospel of Mark. Because if you notice, I think even in the English, it's always like he's here, and then he's here, and he's here, and then he's here. And the way that it's presented in Greek in the text is and immediately, and immediately, and immediately.
Ah, he likes that. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think that on one hand, you could say like, yeah, sure, oral tradition, these are markers, the and immediately. I actually read it more like, again, like picture the Twilight Zone music. Nobody knows who he is, and then he's here, and then he's here, and then he's here, right? So it's very mysterious. And even the original ending of the gospel was, and then people were afraid and they ran away and they didn't say anything about it. So the whole thing is kind of cloaked in mystery in a way that makes me feel like that's not a really great foundational story for the explanation of how Christianity then exploded around the empire. If like nobody knows who he is and nobody wants to talk about it and everybody's scared and nobody, like it's not the best premise, right?
I'm writing just so you know, I'm writing an article. I'm using it's going to be in Bart Ehrman's blog. I'm excited about it because I don't ever write, but I took some time on this, and it pretty much saying like everyone should be doubting Thomas is the whole goal, to get like Christians who are so confident to like lower your confidence level based on the Bible. I don't have to go outside of it and like showing you like they didn't even know who he was in Mark. And I kind of took this guess. I mean, this is really a speculative, I think, scholarly position to think about, is that Mark doesn't have the 12 ever get an appearance. What does it take to be an apostle, an appearance of the risen Lord? And I wonder if this is a jab toward like a Pauline side saying, whoever they were, it doesn't matter to me. I know I'm an apostle. And he's attacking other people. And I wonder if the non-appearance to the 12 is kind of a way of Mark saying they didn't get it, but don't worry, Paul did, or something like it.
So that was going to be my second point, is I do think whoever wrote Mark has read some of the letters of Paul, because another thing that gets a little bit lost in that text is that, we read miracle stories like what happens in Mark 5 with, say, the healing of the hemorrhaging woman, and some of the other, so-called miracles or wonder workings that he does. And we just think, yeah, miracle, the Spirit can, Paul shot out of his cloak. Sure. But if you actually like look in the Greek and look at the terms being used, those are similar terms to what Paul uses. They're technical, philosophical, often Greco-Roman philosophy terms, trying to explain moral psychology, trying to explain physics, like what we would call kind of a proto-physical idea of how the world works. And so I don't think the way that, say, Spirit in the text, the word in Greek is pneuma, but you can just call it pneuma. So the word in Greek is one that has all kinds of meaning, that is like the best science of its day, essentially. And so I don't think you can read Mark without, whether or not he read Paul, he's imbued in the same kind of philosophy. Again, something we've lost a little bit in translation. But I think that it's a much more sophisticated text in terms of the thought behind it. And there are a lot more to mine, like you're describing, because if I'm right that he's using Pauline philosophy, like Middle Platonic concepts, and then you're right that it's a dig at the disciples, then imagine that in combination with that, and that text then is doing something much different than like preserving the oral speech of the community, right? Like that is what I've been trying, like that is coming in and saying Paul's right, not, the people who were surrounding Jesus. And it creates a whole other dynamic. Someone else who came to mind for me while we were just talking about this, there's a piece by Bill Arnall. I think it appeared in Method and Theory in the Study of Religion. I'd have to look. But he argues that he can tell that the author of Mark is in exile, that maybe he, after the war in Jerusalem, ended up having to exile himself outside of Judea. And so this is, a text that's imbued with that as a background, as the impetus for writing. The thing I like about that is it gives an alternative explanation for why write it, other than I just want to preserve the words of Christ, right? Mm-hmm. Like it gives, people have multivalent reasons for doing what they want to do in terms of writing a text or communicating something. And so the more that we can imagine these gospels outside of strict canon and their function as this origin story, because that's what they were collated to do in later centuries, right? They're put together with the letters of Paul, and it's a nice little package that tells this origin story. but it might not have been written for that purpose. It's just being used for that purpose.
Well put.
But we shouldn't confuse that with the historical impetus for its writing or who wrote it, right? So it's two different questions. You can be interested in the origins of Christianity and use these texts as a touch point for talking about that. Or I think you can be interested in the historical circumstances that gave rise to these texts. And because there isn't a strict Christianity in the way that we imagine it now at the time these are being written, to the best of our knowledge, that's a very different question.
Thank you. We have so many other super chats. I like hope that we can miraculously get through them. And immediately another super chat, and immediately another super chat.
Yeah.
So here we go. Is it Philios? I apologize if I butchered your name. Apologists say the Gospels contain place and people's names that are contemporary to Jesus. Therefore, we can trust their reliability. Comments?
Actually, I have a different view of this, which is I wish someone would write more about this. And it's something like in my, list that I keep in my head, like a folder somewhere of like topics I want to look at someday. There have been arguments that, how like Luke begins with this, my dear Theophilus,
Yes.
like writing disorderly account, right? Then that some of the name dropping in the Gospels are actually people paying for these things to be written, or like, like patrons or like friends of the person who's writing it. So you might kind of drop in a name to like give a cameo to a friend of yours. And so that a contemporary friend of the author, not someone from antiquity. Now, so that's one thing to just kind of consider as a possibility. But the other thing is like, yeah, sure, there might have been some knowledge of people who were around Jesus. And if you want to give, authority, credibility to your account, you might drop those names in. The problem is with the passage of time, it would be difficult to, anybody who's reading these from the late first century, second century, there's no longer, I think, a strong touchstone to whatever.
It's more of a debate at that time, like Dr. Litwood talks about, Dr. David Litwood would talk about. There's this debate, pretty much kind of like what my buddy Neil, we'll get to a super chat. I saw he dropped one as well, where the Gospel of Mary makes Mary the one. And in fact, it almost indicates she's the only one who received a vision. Yep. No one else did. But it's like she's jabbing at Peter, which would technically be jabbing at anyone who says Peter's their guy. So now you have these struggles for authority that are just trying to root back and say, that was Peter's scribe. And that's evidence that it's this. And it's like, I personally, like, if I see this internal evidence that I see this problem I'm pointing out, and I'll get to the next one here in just a moment, super chat wise, I just want to make a point. If I'm right that this is a jab at the 12 and Peter's scribe is writing this, it makes no sense to me. It makes more sense.
Think about how brilliant that is, because if you're trying to kind of smooth over fractures because you're trying to establish a cohesive origin story for this movement, because you need one, right? Like you can't just claim that we're all emerging from this fractured movement to create cohesion and solidarity in the present. Then the best way to do that is to be like, you think that Mark is anti-Peter? He was Peter's scribe. How can you say that? What else do you have? Because it's not internal to the text, right?
Right.
So, I can give you a piece of comparanda for that I've always found interesting, which is there's this whole class of art that emerges in late antiquity of Paul and Peter as two, like, little icons, like little head, and they're always like snuggling together or like
I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, I have a whole book of them. And like they're usually like little medallions or like little frescoes where the two of them are like head to head, like, we're best buds. Those two hated each other. So the idea, I'm being a little facetious, but you know what I mean.
Right.
Based on Paul's own testimony on this, like these two were not having a beer. So that later iconography that's like, no, what are you talking about? Yeah, they had their fights, but like, they're bros. So I think there's a lot of that going on.
Good point. Really well put. Sobek, Lord of the Four Corners, thank you for the super sticker, and it was wonderful talking to you, of course, this morning. I try to keep up with my Patreon and like see the messages, and just thanks for the support, my friend. I really appreciate it. Neophyte One, welcome back, and thank you for the super chat. Dr. Walsh, thank you for your contribution to scholarship. Mark has Jesus predicting the apocalypse within his generation. How do we explain an author projecting a failed prophecy into the past?
So there are a couple of prophecies actually in Mark, and they all serve some interesting purposes in terms of authority. I mean, the big one is Mark 13, where he predicts the fall of the temple. And that's how scholars actually date the text. So I just thought it would be helpful to bring that up for a moment, because they assume like, well, it's described, the destruction of the temple is described in such detail that this person must be aware of it, whoever Mark is. And so that's how we can say as scholars, well, we think this is written after the fall of the temple. And then to give Jesus authority, you put that prophecy in Jesus's mouth, to say that, he was correct. And so therefore authorize him as, this Messiah figure. For this particular question, two things come to mind for me right off the bat. The first one is that if this person, whoever Mark was, is adopting Pauline perspectives, let's just call it that, or Pauline philosophy, or is somehow imbued in the world of Paul's version of what we call Christianity, that's all Paul ever talks about.
Yeah.
So so if you're going to repeat everything else Paul says, why are you going to leave that one off, right? So you're gonna embrace that too. So I would say that's probably a big piece of it, just to stay in the company line. The other thing is, the Christians today are saying the same thing. So I could ask the same question for the last 2,000 years. And I even in recent memory, this has been a huge question, right? Who's the Antichrist? I don't want to get political, but I heard discourse during the Trump administration, right. So,
and right now with Putin and all day long. Yeah. There's probably Christians doing this right now. So,
right. So, it's not something that at least to my knowledge has ever stopped being a discourse within Christianity, that the apocalypse or the end times are upon us, or that they're imminent. I think that is just a persistent discourse within.
And it's almost like either they ignore the meaning or they just they go to 2 Peter 3 as their go-to and just go, a day is like 1,000 years. Our time is different than God's, so stop playing games. But I think it's important what you said, just to tack on the way I understood this. I could be wrong. There's some people who want to take it as fulfilled. Tom Wright, N.T. Wright, people that are trying to preserve the problem. And then there's others who will admit there's a problem. But it's the idea that it's almost like an ex eventu thing we see in Daniel. This happened, this happened, this happened, it's not the end yet. Not the end yet. It's about to. All this temple stuff happens, and then they're on the brink of the edge of history, and they're expecting now any moment it's going to happen, kind of like what Paul's doing. They're still keeping that Paul mentality. So this might help us date. There's some scholars who think it's later, way later, and I'm kind of wondering, would they put that in there? Will they say they think that something like there's preserved and then something's added into Mark to say, and Jesus says, well, not even I know the day or the hour. So, get me off the hook for the failure, but keep me on the hook for the fulfillment of the fact that the temple.
So, although who's going to be around to be you got it, nailed it. You know what I mean? But putting that aside, the other thing I'll say that brings it back to philosophy, which is not something I often hear, is that the Stoics, and this is something I think Paul is well aware of, thought that the world cycles. So they often talked about how the world has certain cycles to them and it ends in a conflagration and then a new cycle begins. And so the way I describe this to my students, this is not what the Stoics say, but just to kind of illustrate it, is a vague awareness of there was the age of the dinosaurs, then there was the age, the ice age, and then there was, right? So that's kind of it. And we can talk about dinosaur bones and what the ancients thought of them if you want to. But
maybe another day, I don't know.
I have a whole thing on that. But there was an awareness within Stoicism, or at least a thought that the world does cycle. And so when Paul talks about, an end time scenario, in part, he's thinking about that. He's coupling it with his interpretation of the Hebrew Bible, but he can confirm what he's reading in the Hebrew Bible by also looking at Greco-Roman philosophy and saying, see, even the Stoics say, the world is cyclical. So there's going to be a new kingdom. There's going to be a new age because there always has been. So to predict within a Greco-Roman environment, that ancient Mediterranean environment, that things are going to end, that there's going to be some kind of apocalyptic end time to usher in a new age, that was not an unfamiliar phrase. That was not unique to Christianity, and it was not an unfamiliar phrase. So it's actually in all respects a very safe prediction to make. frankly, to predict the end of the world, because what we might call the end of the world, or to at least predict the end of the present age, because
Right.
that's something that a lot of people.
I mean, even the Mayans, as we know, did have these ideas. So yes, this was an understood concept. And thank you. Stop Scamming Man. Thank you for the super chat. Do you see a motive for the writers to invent the idea of Jesus being a carpenter, son of one? If they claimed he was a shepherd, I could see a motive.
That's a really good question.
A motive for the writers to invent the idea of Jesus being a carpenter or son of one.
Maybe he was a carpenter.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I know that I can only speak on like something that I saw was relevant in Islamic studies. And that was talking to Sean Anthony, who's like a leading historical Muhammad scholar. And he said that there's this debate going on in the early biography material of, was he a merchant, Muhammad, or a shepherd? And they want to divorce him from being a merchant, the believers, the Muslims who have a tradition to hold on to, because they don't want him leaving Arabia ever, because then they're saying, well, how did this information get in there? So they're trying to create a narrative that protects Muhammad from ever knowing any biblical literature. Hence, where did the Quran get these ideas from? Oh, Gabriel, directly from an angel. So the point he was pointing out is, was he a shepherd or was he a merchant? The reason that they would want to point in the direction of being a shepherd is, look at the prophets. Look at all of them. They always come across David, King David, shepherd, shepherd, shepherd. So he could have been. I don't think there's any reason to think it's not possible. But
yeah, and also, I have to go back and look.
I don't know if that's relevant to carpenter, though.
It just occurs to me, and I wish this is, I'll fully admit that I don't have this information on the tip of my fingers at the moment, but I'd have to go back and look at where we get the idea he's a carpenter from. Because I know that Joseph is a carpenter, and so I don't know if it's a presumption that therefore he went into the family business. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
So I'd have to look into that.
Well, thank you so much.
Off my head.
Stop Scamming Man. Thanks a lot. I appreciate it. Neo Fight One. Thank you for the super chat again. I'm still awaiting your book to arrive, but does your model account for the Gospels evolving over several decades?
Yeah, so this is the thing. It's hard to say, right? How they were actually put together. And this is I think, the biggest issue in the field of New Testament, which is that the earliest copies we have of these manuscripts are incredibly old. I think, there's some debate about some, scraps that are from the 2nd century that were found in, say, Oxyrhynchus or something, in a trash heap somewhere. But to have actual manuscripts that are more complete, and even then they're often not complete, we're talking about several hundred years in terms of what our extant evidence is. It's not like we have an autograph copy, what we call an autograph copy, an original copy, or even a very early copy of any of these Gospels, which means when you read any Gospel in any language that's put together, a Bible that you can buy at the store, or even for those who know Greek, when you pick up what's called the Nestle Aland, which is the Greek Bible, that has been put together by scholars or others who are, experts, religious experts of some kind, with several criteria set up for selecting which version they're going to select of a particular story to put into the aggregate, into the thing that we call the gospel itself. So given that, we don't have universal copies around the Mediterranean that all say the same thing. There are huge variations in the texts that survive, the manuscripts that survive. And so scholars will use tools like what's called multiple attestation. Well, if this particular story or sentence often looks the same way, in texts that we find in Rome, or that we find, say, like, in northern Egypt, then we'll say that is probably more original than another version of that sentence, right? But it's not like there was an authoritative version in the early stages. So to be able to say whether or not, and I tend to side more on the side of whoever, say, Mark was, just because we've been talking about Mark, probably didn't only write some of it. He probably wrote the whole thing, and it may have taken him some time, but I think whatever circulated was published, in its initial form, was more or less a complete version of some version of that story. But we may not have that version now. So whatever I'm talking about in terms of gospel, the text, I have to make some presumptions in order to function within those parameters. And they include things like, okay, I'm going to assume a cohesive text of some kind circulated, and it was written at one time, right? So something circulated in the first instance, was published in the first instance, that looked like something like Mark. But that doesn't mean that the Mark that's in our Bibles today is that same piece of literature.
The one thing I take away from this all, because I really enjoy finding out that kind of material, it debunks my old worldview that I used to hold on to, that was such a strict, literal, everything is the word literally of God, and there's not a single error, that kind of
You don't have it.
Right. It's so comforting to hear this. Like, why is everyone so confident? Like, where's your confidence coming from? Please lower your standards a bit and understand that this literature is written by humans. And anyway, yeah, it's just that confidence level.
You have to be trained in it. I took one class on it when I was in graduate school. It's called the apparatus. When you open up the Greek New Testament, again, this thing called the Nestle Island, because of two guys named
Yeah,
it's not a candy bar.
Like Paul and Peter just kissing.
Yeah.
No, I'm just kidding.
They put together what's generally considered an authoritative version of looking at all of these extant manuscripts and trying to put together, like, this is our best guess, or our reasoned guess based on these, identified criteria for how we've aggregated together the scraps that we have from all these extant manuscripts into one cohesive manuscript. And if you look at the bottom in this apparatus, it looks like footnotes. There are all these, like, usually, manuscripts will have some kind of designation, like a P for papyri or something like that. So it'll be like P52, and like we use like these 5 texts that all basically said the same thing, but there was a variation in this one. And so you'll just have these footnotes that explain. And so, really, New Testament scholars, before they talk about those who have looked at my book, if anybody has or anybody does, will notice I don't get into the weeds of like, this particular line of this particular gospel means this, because for me to do that, I would have to chase, to my mind, it would be necessary for me to chase every manuscript that was used to put that line together to figure out where they came from and make judgment. And that becomes a very different book, right? Like, for me to have to chase every single reference. So I tend to think about these books in terms of, okay, something circulated that was more or less what I'm talking about here. It had a story about Jesus. It had a beginning, middle, and end.
Right.
This is probably close to what was there. But on that, like, this adjective or that, or this preposition or that, I don't go there.
Right.
There's just no way for me to know. And I have trouble wasting my time.
Yeah. You could go to Bart Ehrman, like, go to someone who's like specifically a textual critic.
Has been doing that work. He was originally at Yale.
Who?
Brett Nongbree. He wrote a book called God's Library, where he gets into a little bit of this and the mythology around the discovery of these manuscripts, especially ones like Nag Hammadi that were found more recently. And oftentimes even the stories about how these manuscripts came into the possession of somebody or how they were found, there's a lot of mythology around that too. And he gets into that. It's a really interesting subject. And I think it's one that needs more attention in the field.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. So yeah, thank you, Neophyte1, for that super chat. My buddy Neil, Gnostic Informant, we're going to have to get you, I got to get you interviewed by him. He's a huge fan of your work. And so obviously, look at what he says. The origins of early Christian literature, contextualizing the New Testament, changed the way I look at the origins of Christianity forever. Game changer. I got to hook you up with him.
Oh, I would love to. I said there was one thing I wanted to say today, so let me use this as an opportunity to
let me pop your book up next to you while you do this, so people can see it. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. So the one thing I wanted to say today is that I know several people after my last talk emailed me, and some people, if it was quick, I was able to email back, but I've started a folder for the longer questions and people who sent me, invites and wanted to engage more. And I do intend to answer all of those. It's just I'm in the middle of a semester with a full teaching load and a gajillion students. So I haven't been able to, and a million committee meetings. So I just don't have the hours in the day. But I wanted to thank everybody who reached out the last time. It means a lot to me, and I do take it seriously. So even if you don't hear from me right away, it might take me some time. I really appreciate when I get this kind of feedback, especially when it's positive. But I'm glad that people are enjoying the book, and I want to hear your thoughts. So don't hesitate. Just know it might take me a little while to get back to you.
Let me defend you here for a second. Let me tell everybody the real skinny here. She's
No,
not.
no, don't do it.
Okay, so I host a channel, right? My whole intention is to learn from her. This is like, it's very transparent. Like, I offer to advertise academics' works because I love this stuff, and I know you do too. And so when she doesn't get back to me for months, okay, and I'm like offering like, hey, this is some free advertisement to really educate the general public and to like put your book out there, and I don't hear from you, I know you're busy. Trust me. So don't feel bad to the audience. I get shunned as well. She totally
I think that because before I, reached this level in academia, I used to be like, how long? You've got 5 minutes. Like, how long does it take to just write a quick email? So I used to think that. And so I think that's why I'm self-conscious about it, because I used to have like, bad thoughts about somebody who doesn't get right back to me too. But now that I'm on, like, I'm skipping a curriculum committee meeting right now to be here with you. And I had to forward 41 emails to the person who's taking my place. Right?
Yeah, there's all sorts of stuff going on with that. We're not even getting into, but I don't think bad. No, I get it. This is what I do for a living. So I know when I don't hear from John J. Collins for 2 months, it's not he's ignoring me or he doesn't want anything. And that I'm saying to the audience, like, it is not ignoring because we just don't. Now, if you're an idiot and you're coming off as just rude or disrespectful,
I'm gonna.
What do you expect? I mean, yeah. So anyway, Neil, we're gonna hook it up, man. You got to interview her when she's available, of course. As you hear, she's very busy, but game changer. Your work is a game changer.
Thank you.
Thank you. Doc Pleuromanot, thank you for the super chat. Why wouldn't church fathers have attributed authorship of John to Lazarus, as he is redacting Luke to display Jesus' signs and miracles for a loved one to be raised from the dead?
Maybe it would have been a better story if he had. No, I'm kidding. I don't know. Like why they chose those terms is a really interesting, or the names that they did is a really interesting question. Especially because we have sort of become desensitized, right? We just go Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. Like we just say it so fast. I'm not sure what all of the decisions that went behind it were, although in the case of names like Thomas and John, and we know the Gospel of Thomas was later found, could be that there was already something named Lazarus that was out there that we just no longer survives. Could be that there was another Gospel of John out there that it was trying to compete with and sort of overwrite. So that would be an interesting question to go back, roll the tape and figure out, like in context, do we have any evidence for competing discourses that you might choose John, not because it was the best, but because there was something else going on contextually that you had to deal with that made John the right choice?
It makes me wonder. Yeah, there is that issue with Lazarus, but also I don't know why I keep coming back to this Mary thing. I wonder, you kind of wonder, is this the beloved disciple? Is it possible?
Yeah, no, there was a big debate. I mean, I'm sure you've looked at the work of, Elaine Pagels has talked about this. Karen has talked about this. Even in the Gospel of Thomas, which I just mentioned, she's foregrounded in that text in a way that the others are not. So that brings.
The Gospel of Thomas resurrection idea, where it's like they're like, when will be the repose of the dead, and when's that going to come? And Jesus says, look around, you don't see it, but it's already happened. And that idea in John, Dr. Robert M. Price was recently on Neil, Gnostic Informant, the gentleman who really loves your work. He points out Jesus, she's is it Mary or Martha's crying, and then he's like, listen, she says, I know he'll be resurrected in the resurrection. He goes, I am the resurrection. That sounds Gnostic-y. That sounds like, so it makes me wonder if Mary plays a significant role in this, especially if he's crying at her, like she literally touches him in a way that he's weeping, even though he knows he's gonna resurrect him. You can't imagine he's crying because Lazarus is dead. It's this person, this Mary, probably. I don't know. Maybe I'm speculating.
No, but what you're pointing out are what you're doing is exactly what I've been trying to point out, even with the book, which is these are normal authors who have lives, right. and human beings. Like, this is a thing that sometimes people will say to me, like, don't your religious students hate you? Because often, I'll have students who come from a religious background who want to take intro to the New Testament because they think, oh, I know this. And I'll learn something, interesting about this thing that I love. But I've never had a problem with a student who themselves have a faith background. I often even will go to church with them if they ask me to go. I have no problem with that, because what I try to point out is that these do not have to be texts that are the word of God, like preserved in amber, to be meaningful. And that's because it went through the filter of human beings. And we do know that it went through the filter of a human being who lived in the 1st or 2nd century, who wrote in Greek and had fights with people, was sleep deprived, like had toddlers. Like, I'm being a little person.
Right.
No, but you see
this
what I
is
mean?
your
Like,
gospel.
yeah, that's my gospel suddenly. But had arguments with other people, thought that person was a jerk. Like, that text is awful. That human beings are frail. That's also a major point in all of these texts, right? From Plato forward. Even before that, obviously, but I'm thinking the texts that are informing gospels. And so, we are faulty. We are weak, to use another term that we often see. And so that is going to intrude on the idea that this is the inerrant word of God, right? Because it went through us and we have problems. And so the more that you can recognize that, then you can start to ask those questions like, okay, so this was a human being who wrote this. So what do we need to know about history to know how people in that period wrote, the things that motivated them? And then can we detect, we're almost like little detectives trying to figure out, like, well, wait a minute, maybe this is about Mary. Like, why? Like, all those questions that everybody's asking, they're brilliant. Because to say, like, well, why John? Beautiful question. I love that question. I would be like, please go write me a paper, if you were in my class, like, explore it. Because this was a human being wrote this, and there's a reason they picked, that later people picked that name for this text, because it was performing a certain function in a social situation of other human beings. And we have to figure out what that situation was.
It'd be awesome to be a student of yours. I really love that philosophy and the way that you're approaching this. Thank you for that. Neophyte 1 is back. Do you believe the anonymous authors had the intention of producing history to be believed, like Josephus, who mixed history and legend? By the way, before, I just got to poke this in there. Neophyte, excellent question. I was thinking about this earlier. Dennis McDonald and Matthew David Litwa just recently had a show with me. I had both of them on at the same time. This is a part where they disagree, I think. It's very difficult to get into.
What did they say? I want to hear that. I got my tea right here.
Well, I'm not going to go long. I just want to point out in this question to get your thoughts. Dr. Litwa believes that these were written to convince people of Jesus. Okay. He thinks there's something like that going on. The author is writing to convince. Dr. McDonald thinks that these are kind of epics. Like, they're not like apologetic tools, so to speak, to convince people. It seems, I might be wrong, correct me if I'm wrong in the chat, but it sounded like this is where they had a disagreement. I think this question is an interesting one. These anonymous authors had the intention of producing history to be believed, like Josephus, who mixed history and legend. What are your thoughts?
Well, let's be careful here, because Josephus is not writing just on the pure motivation for people to believe him.
Right.
Depending on the text and the context that we're talking about, he's writing under the auspices of the Flavians, who will probably cut his head off if he says anything that they don't like, right? So the idea that he's mixing quote unquote facts with legend, he's doing so in a very particular context, kind of back to what I was saying before. What I would say is the same about Josephus and the gospel writers is the idea that you're mixing quote unquote historical fact with certain literary tropes and approaches and themes. And more than anything else, you're tied again to the parameters of a particular kind of genre. To the extent that Josephus is writing history, he does so in the way that you see with Herodotus or Thucydides or, name any number of authors from the ancient world. They're falling within certain parameters and genre expectations. And the Gospels, I think, are doing the same thing. And so I can understand where they're both coming from. I think they're both a little bit right, because you can see, I agree with McDonald, that you see elements of the literary in the Gospels insofar as, you can detect things like Homeric speech or, influence. As I think I mentioned last time, I'm working now on the idea that Mark is to some extent inspired by Virgil. because I do think, again, these are elite authors, culturally, maybe not economically, but culturally elite authors who have read these things potentially, or at least are aware of them. There's an author named Mimi Palmer Bonds who wrote a book years ago on Luke Acts as epic, who also agrees that, there's kind of the epic is present in something like the Gospels, but I think it's because it's engaging so many different facets of literature. And so it's falling within those genres. And so that's why I think they're both able to make those kinds of claims. But again, they can't be neutral claims. There is a context that we know for Josephus that makes him say something different about, say, the temple destruction in one case versus the other. When it's for the eyes of the Flavians, it's, the Romans didn't want this to happen. Like they were standing in front of the temple. No, stop. And the Roman soldiers, they just got so, there was nothing we could do. And then on the other hand, it's like, those assholes, right?
Right.
He changes his approach depending on context.
He sounds like a politician,
I think he was trying to save his own ass.
Right. I mean, wouldn't you? I know I would.
Yeah. What was the alternative? According to him, he was in that circle, that like execution circle, and like miraculously was saved. But he made his choice. But he had to, he had a very different life.
So just on the Gospels, because Josephus will throw us a wrench and make us think of something else, and I'm glad you addressed it. But as far as the Gospels go, you would say you agree there's kind of a both going on. I had a lot of people comment with the Dennis and Litwa discussion, and they thought both of these views are like not incompatible. It almost seemed like both are possibly true in some way.
Yeah, I'm a little bit, it might come across as a little bit lazy, I guess, but like on these kind of questions, I don't get that hopped up on like, it must be this, because what I tend to think is, I forget the percentages, but scholars have talked about this, like how many texts do we think were produced in the ancient world and how many survive? And we have a fraction, absolute fraction of everything that was produced. There might have been something out there that we've lost, or that maybe was even intentionally destroyed, that would have been a key, to exactly what was going on with these Gospels, right? But it's gone now. And so what we have to work with is what we have to work with. So sometimes, back to my students, I give them an exercise where I say it's 4,022. Something happens where, now only 10% of whatever was like part of material culture and like texts survive. And part of it is like the syllabus for this class. Tell me, I'm teaching a gender course right now in the ancient world. Tell me what people thought of gender in 2022, right? Based on just what I've assigned for this class.
Oh, wow.
You have to connect the dots, right? And it demonstrates like what an incomplete picture that is. And it's a picture that's a version of our present day. It's a version of, the kinds of texts and discourses and material that we produce. But it's not the full picture, right? So we're just doing the best we can with what survives to draw certain conclusions. And like, we'll never, unless, more texts are discovered or a time machine, we're not going to be able to go back and prove anything really, but we can make some educated, again, guesses or draw educated conclusions based on things like how much this is what I am into. Like, what can I tell you for sure? How much papyri cost? Who had access to it? Who could afford ink? How was it made? Like, how did you obtain books? Who had the luxury time, like the time and the luxury to read them? How are they used? How are they exchanged? Like, what did booksellers do? Like, content can only get me so far. It becomes the practices that I think tell us more in the end, because that's how I can draw the conclusion. Well, I think these gospel authors must have been much more elite than we think, because just to have the time, the means, the energy, the education, right, to write anything and publish it was very different from the picture of like the oral tradition and like the huddled masses of like persecuted Christians hiding in like the attic, right? Like that, that's a story. That's not a history.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah, there's so much there. Scholar Vid, thank you for the super chat. He said, this woman burned a few brain cells of mine with the Star Wars versus Christianity analogy. Is it getting any traction in scholarship?
I'm teaching that class right now, other than my gender class. I'm teaching Is Star Wars a Religion right now. So I'm surprised somebody knows about that. That's really interesting. I don't know if it's getting any traction in scholarship. I wrote one piece for the Huffington Post a long time ago about it. Other than that, I mean, I have to say, when I teach the class, there isn't really a lot of scholarship that I can fall back on within religious studies. So I end up teaching the course like a theory and method course, in the sense that we start off with, I use Star Wars as the case study to talk about new religious movements and how they develop and how we do things like define religion. Because there's one book called The Myth Awakens that I use, that's an edited volume that talks a little bit about Star Wars and religion. But, you know, I literally bring in like the tax exemption paperwork in New Zealand to authorize Star Wars as a religion, as a recognized religion, and census documents. And so we go over all of that to say, like, of course, you know, students are like, it's not a religion. Like, it's just a movie. Like, you know, I'm watching Boba Fett right now. Like, it's not, right? Like, it's not a religion. But when you look at the way text practices fan fiction, you know, like we even talk about death of the author, you know, the concept of death of the author. Like, when you look at all of these facets, it ends up, you know, students bring all of that pre-knowledge. You know, nobody really signs up for a Star Wars class unless they know something about Star Wars. Unless it really fits into their schedule. But right. Nobody signs up for a Star Wars class unless they're already kind of a fan. And so they have all of this wealth of knowledge from something that they enjoy, and they get to see it from a different lens, and in the meantime, learn something about the study of religion. So it's really sneaky. You know, after about a month, I tell them, like, you do realize you're like in a really deep philosophical, like, theory class right now, right? Like, you thought it's going to be like, you know, talking about lightsabers for 14 weeks. No. You know? Man. So I don't know that it's gotten a lot of scholarly traction. There was one other edited volume that came out a little while ago I looked at. I won't name it, but I didn't find it particularly helpful. So maybe, you know, when I'm done all of this heavy lifting with papyri and, you know, Koine and figuring out, you know, economics and antiquity, I'll do an edited volume on Star Wars and religion.
That would be awesome. I'm sure a lot of people would jump on that. S. Duck said, do you feel, and thank you for the super chat, everybody, do you feel your gender helps you see other aspects your male counterparts don't initially see?
Wow,
it's a good question.
That's a really good question. You know, I'll say a couple of things. It's a delicate question too. So if I stumble a little bit, I'm just trying to be politic as much as I can. The field of New Testament is pretty young. The critical study of the New Testament is young relative to other fields, insofar as I would say there's only really maybe about 4 to 5, maybe now, generations of scholars. So I say in the book early on, you know, one of my instructors at Harvard was a student of Bultmann.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So, I mean, like, we're talking only like 3 generations from like the OG dudes, like
Germany,
who were, so that's not a lot of time. And I will say that this particular scholar that I'm referencing was a Lutheran minister. And many of the early scholars in this field, not all, there are exceptions, and I can talk about the 19th century, although it's not that interesting for a quick chat. But a lot of them did have faith-based interests in this material. And I shouldn't even use they necessarily, except I mean men. You know, these were men who had positions of authority in the church, and in many cases, they were the only ones who could have that authority. And so there's a little bit of a feedback loop there, right? You know, like, if you're standing on the pulpit on Sunday trying to use the canonical New Testament to tell stories about Christian history, and use the cohesion that it suggests as an origin story for Christianity to draw conclusions about how to live one's present life, you're not going to then go in scholarship and dismantle all of that, right? Because, you know, on a very kind of practical level, then you're like, you know, you're hurting your own brand, right? Like, you're undermining your own career, never mind your own faith position. But it would be incongruous to do that. And so I will say that because authority was the purview of men, because even to be in the academy in general was the purview of men until, I mean, there are very few women in the field still today. I'm one of 2 women in my department.
Wow.
So there are so few of us. So I think that it has allowed, sometimes, you know, you need the outsider to see patterns that maybe others don't see. And that's not to denigrate anybody, but to just say that if you've never been challenged because you've already been in that position of authority, whether it's authority as a man, authority as an academic, authority as a senior colleague in a department, authority as a senior scholar, authority as, a religious expert that in a field that's only available to men, then it's, again, just this feedback loop, right?
Right.
It takes outsiders, whether it's women or people of color or people from underrepresented groups, to come in and say, like, why on earth have you perpetuated that?
Right.
Like, that makes no sense. Oh, well, because, my mentor, my Dr. Vater, like, that's what they always say, like, my mentor, taught, like, okay, so your mentor taught you that, like some scholar, like Dusty Scholar taught you that, like in, 1930. So, right? Like,
Right.
we've been doing some work over here in classics. We've been doing
kind of figured a thing out since then.
A couple things out over here in anthropology or like, other field or cognitive science. Like, do you ever realize like you're making the ancients sound like children? That, like, have no mind of their own. Like, there's often that kind of discourse of like, they were childlike, innocent, naive, just like, enjoying it. You see that all the time in the German scholarship.
Wow.
Of course, they perpetuated oral tradition because it was easier for them, because like they didn't live in like a literate world. So like they heard something, they just memorized it. Like, since when have brains changed that fast, right? Like, you can have devices to memorize something, but that's why I emphasize, poetry or lyric. Sure. Prose, you're telling me that like, everybody wants the ancients to be this filter for everything they think, right?
Yeah. Just like historical Jesus studies, you find the Jesus you want to find.
Yeah, you find the revolutionary, you find the zealot, you find the
feminist, you find any Jesus you want to find, you can find if you look hard enough. That's what I'm saying. Like, if they bring their package with them. So I guess you would say to that question in particular, though, right? When you say that there's something that you bring that you've seen that is overlooked, maybe because of the gender thing?
I definitely, because I'm a little bit less beholden to the authority of men, temperamentally, like I'll give credit to my parents for that. But, raised in more of a feminist mindset, I guess. Like, I don't automatically take at face value what, like a male authority tells me. I'll say that. So I can remember being in this scholar that I mentioned, who was the student of Boltmann, being in his classes and, having to write down like the strategy that he had for saying that the word interpolation, like, that some of these texts had something intruded upon them, that there was like an original text, in this case, Paul, but somebody went into his letters and added this and that. And so he used to say, like, I can tell these things were interpolated this and this and this and this because Boltmann told me. And I would say, like, how does he know? Like, in my head, I'd be thinking, but what is the criteria? He's not explaining. How does he know this? And in the end, Paul just looked like Luther. And I'd like, but you're a Lutheran minister, right? Like, you just manipulated this ancient text, took out everything you don't like that's like not Lutheran, and made Paul a Lutheran because Boltmann told you to, right? Like, so I just remember so clearly, like, I remember where I was sitting in one of those lectures being like, so I got to replicate this to graduate. I know that, but this makes no sense. And so the rest of my career, so far being like, maybe I can prove it, maybe I can demonstrate it to myself, but I couldn't take that testimony at face value because I didn't see that kind of authority as definitive.
If I could throw one question in the middle of these super chats, just to get your thoughts. Dr. Robert M. Price, he's a big fan. He's like one of the last standing, if you will, in the tradition of Dutch radicals. Would you say the Dutch radicals are kind of doing that, what you're describing here? Yeah. Like, okay, so are they trying to...
I love that, Dutch radicals. I didn't know we were calling them that. I like it.
Oh, you didn't know that? Yeah. They call it, well, because they went too far, according to some, or the majority will say they've dissected Paul to the point where there's almost, some of them will say nothing there. Like they're almost like, Paul didn't write any of this. There's nothing there. It's all like patchwork quilts, as Dr. Price will put it, of like later Christian tradition in Pauline schools that have compiled this literature. When I read it, right, maybe I'm not omniscient and I just don't see that, but I'm like, I'm not that critical. Like, I'm kind of a disciple, if you could say, of Dr. Price, but I am not. I tell him, like, I'm not a mythicist. He thinks there probably wasn't a Jesus based on the criteria we're looking at. I think there probably was, but I'm not going there. I'm just making the point, like, the Dutch radicals, are they in that Lutheran vein?
I think what happens sometimes is that in a desire to be critical of a particular kind of method, you can end up accidentally deploying the same method, but in the reverse. Do you see what I mean? So like you end up being like, those interpolations aren't right. These interpolations are right? Like I'm going to overcorrect for the Lutheran interpretation by this radical interpretation, but I'm using the same method. And if the method is faulty, then both conclusions are going to be wrong, right? So I think that can be the problem. So, not to point like anybody out specifically.
No, I get it.
But yeah, the knee-jerk reaction can be like, well, this must be wrong. Therefore, so like I'll just make it personal because it's easier to talk about myself and make myself a target than anybody. I don't want to put anybody on the hot seat. But I've given a couple of talks about this book where people will say like, well, you want to get rid of oral tradition. And so you want to erase indigenous voices and, say oral tradition is wrong. And I say, I never said that. I was careful in the book to say oral tradition may be a factor here. I, as a scholar, don't know how to find it. So let me focus on what I think that I can, through comparative evidence and analysis and historical context, demonstrate.
Right.
Well, yeah, sure. It could be there. Here are the parameters that I would set as like, the preconditions for that kind of evaluation. But I'm not going to get into that because it's not my principal interest. And so I'm not dismissing it. I'm sure whoever wrote Mark talked to some people who also thought Jesus was real, right? Like I'm not,
right.
Or heard stories. I mean, Luke says that. I talk to people who say that they were there, right? So I'm not dismissing it as part of the process. What I'm saying is I think there's a different historical context here. So I don't overcorrect to like, well, then there's no oral tradition, right? I just say like, let's put that over here for a minute. Let's bracket it. Not saying it doesn't exist. I'm just saying, let's look at this in a different way. And then we can bring that back in to figure out if we can find out a new way to approach this. So I just try to be really measured and not overcorrect.
Yeah, and I wonder sometimes if we get too critical. And I'm not necessarily saying you, but
yeah.
when I got into this stuff, I'm like, are we doing too much here? Are we thinking something doesn't belong that actually might? Are we thinking something does belong that doesn't? And there's so many issues here, but I'll keep moving. Courtney Thompson, thank you so much for the super chat. I really appreciate the support there. I didn't see a comment, so just showing some love here. Let me move on down to the next one here. This has been a blast, by the way, so far. So, Doc Pluralmanat, thank you for the super chat. Ignatius quotes phrases from Matthew like the tree is known by its fruit, but never ascribes authorship. Is he using anonymous written text or interacting with oral traditions?
I'd have to go back and look at it. It's hard for me to talk about something without looking at it.
Right.
But this is part of a larger problem potentially that also other scholars in the field are starting to look at, which is when do we know the Gospels were actually on the scene? So I think this gets at that problem. And if I had to, make a prediction of where the field's going to go in the next, like my generation and say the next 20 years, I think that people are going to start to look again at the dates of the Gospels, because the dates we have right now, Matthew's right at 70, and then 10 years later, it's Matthew, like, this, and then like 10 years later, it was why 10 years? I don't know. Like, I guess that's just how long it takes to cook. I don't understand. Like, I've never seen anybody like explain why
the methodology behind exactly knowing that.
Sometimes people are like, "Oh, well, John must be early 2nd century," and then sometimes people will be like, "No, like it's got to be like the earliest one. We've gotten that wrong." And like, why we say any of that, I actually have no idea. Like I hear arguments, but I'm not convinced by them. And so when you look at this kind of evidence that this person is contributing here to our knowledge of this, like to say that these church fathers, they're referencing what we now recognize as the canonical Gospels often, we don't know what they're looking at. Like we often don't know exactly. Sometimes they give a name to them, but it's later. And so, there are some scholars starting to say like maybe these Gospels are 2nd century. Or maybe they were written in the 2nd century to solve problems that are arising between church fathers to claim they were earlier.
This is exactly what lit was.
What I found, oh, you were fighting with me about, X, Y, and Z. I found this gospel and it, says this, and this, and that wouldn't take away from, the premise of what I'm trying to posit. I just accept gospels are first century because that's what everybody, says. And I just go with like the predominant line in my field, but I continue to say but these things did not function the way that we see them functioning today until the 2nd century and later.
Right.
Whenever they were written. And so especially who are the church fathers? They're literate elites. So if the gospels are being used, written, manipulated, quoted, whatever in the, by these church fathers, that it just kind of proves my point. These gospels were written in a social context that's not the huddled masses hiding in the attic.
Yeah, I think Mark and Matthew are the only two that I kind of would wrestle with this first century thing. I'm really convinced, not dogmatic, but I'm pretty convinced that Luke is after Josephus writes his 93 publication, 93 AD. I'm there with who's I don't know why I slipped the Hermeneia commentary on Acts. Purvo. I'm with Purvo in terms of it probably being in the 120s, 130s, Luke Acts, for other reasons. But Mark and Matthew's got, it's a weird gospel. That's why I need to interview your friend because
Erin Roberts.
Yes, I have to get her on. She blew me away in that interview, and I really want to talk to her about this because there's some academics like Delcy Allison Jr. here. I've got his commentaries. And he admits when I interviewed him, right, all 3 of them, I feel special. I had to show it. I feel like you got to brag.
Yeah.
Yeah. I got to sit in front of this guy. He's like a mage. So he says, I purposely tried to avoid finding problems of replacement theology, we call it. It was called something else before that, but it's the idea that God is done with Israel and moving on. And he didn't want to find that because he's because he believes, and he said that admittedly. So I like his honesty, but I want to talk to her about this because it sounds kind of later. This idea that the church has replaced Israel, just.
Mm-hmm. And also, her, to my mind, there's no greater scholar right now on the Gospel of Matthew than Erin Roberts. And she's working on a book that will come out with Oxford shortly. It's actually pretty much written right now, so it should be coming out quite soon. But she argues that Matthew is very aware of Stoic philosophy. And she focuses when Jesus gets angry in Matthew, because the way anger is described and treated. I hope she doesn't mind. Sorry, Erin, that I'm
she'll go over it again.
She's got it, But she argues that when Jesus expresses anger, the way that it's described and treated in that gospel is exactly what you find in Stoic philosophy. So, there's always this idea that Matthew is the Jewish gospel because it brings in so much of the Hebrew Bible. But she's actually saying, no, what's mistaken as this, and often used as an anti-Semitic depiction of Judaism in the Gospel of Matthew because of things like the expression of anger. They're not, they might have been used for anti-Jewish purposes later, but when this was written, it was very aware and imbued with Stoic philosophy. And so then you have to start asking questions like, when is Stoic philosophy at its peak? We know that Paul's using it too, right? And so it brings in, again, a whole new historical question about timeline, about influence, and
I almost said phone a friend while we're on a live. Just kidding. Don't do that. All right.
Has she texted me while I've been here? No.
Hey, I told you not to say no. Avros, thank you for the super chat. I call Star Wars America's greatest contribution to mythology. I came to appreciate mythos in religion culture by listening and reading Joseph Campbell.
Mm-hmm. I think that Lucas would agree with you. He one thing that we watch in my class on Star Wars is an interview that he did. He was given the Kennedy Center Honors one year, and he did an interview with the now canceled Charlie Rose. So I just, want to premise that, but it's still available. And in it, he talks about how he believed that America had no national mythology. And so his idea of what mythology is not the kind of description of mythology or religion that you would get from a scholar, right? He has very kind of pop culture understanding, but I think that, and he, amalgamates a bunch of different ideas of the ancients in a way that as a scholar, I'm like, oh, like you can't do that. But I think that he does know the work of people like Joseph Campbell,
Right.
and is engaging in that kind of understanding of mythology. And so he often toggles between saying that he was trying to create a national mythology for America. And certainly there's a lot of, like stormtroopers are clearly a reference to the Third Reich, like all the imagery of there is from World War II. There's elements, he always says, I'm a 60s kid. So there are elements there of commenting on things like Vietnam. So you can see the political quite a bit in Star Wars. But as it concerns mythology, he also often talks about how he made the movie for children, and this idea that children, thrive off of mythology and mythological storytelling. So I completely agree that is probably one of the, if not the impetus, other than, artistic output for Lucas. It's one of the things he claims now. Of course, when you listen to Lucas now being like, oh, I had no idea it was going to be a big deal. Oh, like I'm an art house. Like he's got a little bit like he's high on his own supply.
Either that, or he might maybe I'm speculating here. I'm just throwing it out there. Can you imagine someone trying to pretend that it was almost divine, that it came to be like, I didn't know it was going to become what it is, but
yeah, no, I had no idea. It was just a Western in space.
But isn't like the first
and here's my $4 billion. Like, oh, yeah, that all went out there.
I was thinking of The Wizard of Oz too. That has a lot of political indications in that film, of course. And
1939 I also teach a history of film class, religion in film. And 1939, when Wizard of Oz came out, like the Women came out that year, Gone with the Wind came out that year. There's a lot going on in 1939 reflecting. You could do a whole book, I think, on just that year in film and the story that America was telling itself, particularly, with the specter of what would, World War II, about their own national mythology. And so Star Wars then emerges at another rupture point in the 20th century that I think is interesting. And in a period, too, where you could make a movie like that. You can't quite make, the same kind of radical art house film anymore, given, the stranglehold Marvel has on. Anyway, that's another.
Right.
Put me on for the film interview sometime, but
we definitely need to.
Yeah.
All right. Avaros is back. Thank you for the 20, my friend. Epirosis was a cosmic event, but Mark's Olivet discourse and Old Testament reference to Isaiah 13:10, etc., is strictly local. Destruction of Jerusalem, and the same in Marcion's Gospel of Lord, underlying Luke. Was Mark's eschaton local?
Well, I mean, the article that I referenced earlier, Bill Arnall, would say no, because the problem is, when do we think these things are being written? And so, if I understand the question correctly, this is going to be a worldwide event, whether or not, something like Jerusalem itself is the focal point of this particular author's imagination is kind of a literary question, more so than one that I can necessarily say anything about historical reality. But I would recommend that the viewers look up Bill Arnall's article on exile and displacement in Mark, because I think it would go a long way to answering this kind of question, at least in the eyes of one scholar.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate that, Avaros. And this has been a conversation he's had with me in Messenger, actually, on Facebook. And just trying to pin it down. Is it just local? Because if it's just local, then it didn't fail, right? Because this idea. Or is it universal? If it's universal in some sense, how did it
okay, let's go back to Paul. For Paul, it's universal, right? Right. Or if Mark's inspired by Paul, right? So it becomes a
question.
Right. But then I'm, there are a few things that I'm predicating that answer on, that Mark's Pauline, et cetera. But, to the extent that text is reflecting anything that this author holds in reality, certainly the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem would have demonstrated that it wasn't a local event in and of itself. Right. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. Mr. Monster says, and this is in the vein of your work, how far back do we know when the first Gospels were being preached in churches? Were they being preached as soon as they were written or much later? And just before you answer that, I want to let everybody know we're wrapping up here in 9 minutes. I cannot keep her too long. And the reason why is I want her to come back. And she has a family and she has a lot going on.
I have a Phi Beta Kappa meeting at 1. So I have a committee meeting. So
I knew that. That's why I was.
And I had to actually drive there, so I'll have to wrap it up. Okay, so a couple things. So the word gospel, the good news, right? That the word gospel in Greek, it's good news, and we give it the term gospel. Even Paul talks about having a gospel. So in terms of like gospels being first, quote unquote, preached within some kind of setting we might call a church setting or some kind of community setting, Paul's talking about that. We don't know or think, like it's unclear what his gospel was. And it might have just been, he doesn't seem to care too much about the historical Jesus the way that we do later, but who knows what he was talking about. So in terms of like the good news, we do have testimony from Paul, just to be clear, that he's doing that in the quote unquote communities that he's talking to early on. If I assume what the question is asking are, these 4 canonical gospels that we've been talking about in the New Testament. So the question asked, were they, written and then immediately preached to churches? I'm not convinced that was the context of their writing. I think that there's a lot going on in those texts that would be interesting to people outside of a Christian church context. And so it's possible that they were written not for a community, but like any other kind of writing in the ancient world for like a broader consumption. If they were then picked up by a particular community and then used within that context for what we might call religious purposes of being read out loud and sermons being given and that kind of thing, that's kind of a different question. And then you would go to the church fathers to try to locate like who's the first one who says that this is being, preached in this context, right? So then I would say go to the 2nd century.
Thank you so much for that. 2 more here. Bolt Hazard, thank you for the super chat. Do you know Jonathan, is it Pegu? I don't know. And the Symbolic World channel?
Mm-mm.
No.
Thank
you for the super chat. I don't. If you were asking me, I don't either. So
okay.
I would need to look into this. But thank you for the super chat.
I also don't have time to ever watch TV or
I know. Trust me, you really are busy.
I know this has become a theme today. People are gonna think I don't want anybody to feel bad for me. I'm fine.
No.
I just
call 911.
Yeah. Exactly.
Hello?
Yeah, no, I just don't. I did make time to watch House of Gucci in the last couple of weeks. That's the last thing I saw.
You're awesome. Excuse me, but thank you for the super chat. Seriously, I've been planning to contribute to your trip fund. I'm going to Israel in October. So.
Oh, great.
And now is the perfect time. I don't have a question, but love Dr. Walsh's feigned innocence voice as well as her knowledge and perspective.
I don't know when I feigned innocence. I thought I've been pretty.
Well, I think that, and correct me if I'm wrong, everybody in the chat, I have too many guys on the channel. I mean, it's because this field is loaded with.
Feminine. Got it.
I would say, I mean, we need a softer touch, and I have it's a sausage fest. Let's just be honest. It's like nothing but guy after guy after guy, and it's because the field is loaded with that. But I have I feel. I got to pat myself on the back. I made a trip to Colorado and interviewed with Elaine Pagels. We did 60 interviews in person. I mean, I spent 2 full days in her living room.
Wow.
And we recorded. And I have 40 to 45 videos, maybe more, still on my Patreon that haven't made it onto YouTube.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah. So I mean, maybe I need to start leaking more. I need to leak more out to the public so people are like, what's going on with guys?
The other thing I think could be going on is that I tend to be pretty, I've been saying all along, very discreet, this is what I feel like I can describe, and whatever else is going on, I don't know. So I think sometimes when I'm I don't know, that seems I'm innocent or naive of other things, and I can understand why, but I think it's because I try not to make big pronouncements of this is what this is, and I know it, and anybody, fight me, right? I don't.
Right.
I do that sometimes, depending on the subject, if it's something like a, discrete problem within Paul or something, I might be fight me. I think I've definitely done that at when I've given a paper somewhere or something like that.
Right.
But in this kind of mode, I'm just trying to be careful. I'm not going to go over my skis. I feel like this is what I can describe and here are the problems. And I'm just usually pretty upfront about what I know and what I don't. So I think it's probably a good thing for us to do as a field, because I think the conversations are important, right? Like the conversations and like being generative, coming up with like maybe new knowledge or like solidifying the knowledge that we do have. Like that should be the goal.
Well put. Last one, Avaros. Oz is a commentary on monetary conflict, silver versus gold standard. Dorothy wore silver sandals, supporting poor farmers. The yellow brick road is a gold standard. And William J. Bryan, the cowardly lion, etc. Interesting.
That is interesting. The other person I know who has written about this a little bit is Heather Cox Richardson, who wrote a book called How the South Won the Civil War that came out a couple years ago. And she often does YouTube she does her own kind of YouTube films. She's a professor, I think, at Boston College or Boston University. I'm sorry, I can't remember off the top of my head. But in that book, How the South Won the Civil War, she talks about film. And I know she talks about Gone with the Wind. Whether she talks about Oz too, Wizard of Oz, I think she does, but she talks about it in this kind of historical context and does a reading of that. And that might be interesting for viewers to take a look at.
If I could sneak this in, Digital Hammurabi, really good friends of mine. I don't know if they're that good of friends after this super chat, but we'll see. Really enjoyed her book. Glad to see this interview, even if it is with someone like Derek.
I don't know him that well. He seems pretty nice.
I think that's Josh.
I do.
That's got to be Josh, because him and his wife like run the channel, and I don't know if it's Megan. Anyway, love you. Thank you for the super chat. I want to have you on to talk about Paul in the future if we can. Yeah. Like, you know a lot about Paul, and that would tie in somehow, I think, into maybe what we see in later Gospels. But
I actually went to grad school for Paul. I didn't go to grad school on the Gospels. I just ended up doing that because I studied the New Testament broadly. But Paul's like, that's your
dude.
Yeah, that's my dude. So.
That's your dude. Look, I can tell when we talked last time you teased me. So as we're leaving here, everybody go get the book. Go to a library if you can't afford it. And trust me, we understand. She understands. We all understand. If you can't afford the book, it is quite expensive, but it is an academic press. So that is a headache to deal with. The Origins of Early Christian Literature. Go to a library, get it. Her website, robynfaithwalsh.com. We have a previous episode. If you haven't watched her and she is new and you're like, hold on, where's more of this? I've interviewed her before on Everything You Thought You Knew About the Gospels Is Wrong, where she does an actual presentation breaking down on how she's understanding these gospel texts. And then, of course, consider helping support us here at MythVision. We got a Patreon. I had, all sorts of videos, and including, like I said, Elaine Pagels, you name it, John J. Collins, Joe Baden, you name it. I even have more of Goodacre. There's a lot on there that I haven't made public. You can go fish around in there. Thank you for everybody support. And
thank you for all the comments. I've been reading the comments too.
Yeah.
These are good. I've really enjoyed this. So thank you, everybody. And again, reach out. It might take me a little while, but always happy to hear from people.
All right. We are live, MythVision podcast. I'm always excited about these episodes with Dr. Robyn Faith Walsh. How are you?
Fine, thanks. Thanks for having me again.
Thank you. It looks like you're going to be trying to survive the hurricane down there at the moment.
Yeah, we have apparently it's a tropical storm officially. At least that's what my warning text messages are telling me. So if anybody loses me, I'll either try to come back on but we have a lull right now. It's not so bad. But if you see me doing this, I'm just watching the tornado go by. Right?
There's a trailer flying at my house right now. And
exactly. Yeah.
I titled this just like, what the heck is Paul up to? Right? Like, there's so many Pauline scholars and so much Pauline literature. And I recently had Jennifer Bird come on, and she kind of made this comment, like, she made a comment something like, look, there's all these white men that like die on this hill about Paul, trying to figure out Paul. Like we got real world matters that are going on. But I figure we could dive into what you think is happening with this guy in this episode, at least to go 35 minutes or so, where we're going back and forth. People can super chat their questions. And once we kind of have fun going into this, creativity might come up for more questions and they can ask, and then we'll take super chats and go from there.
Okay, that sounds great. So what do you want me to say?
Well, the first thing I'd like to do is let everybody know they didn't quite know this about you. And this is something that since you're a MythVision follower, you get to see the sneak peek. She's actually one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. If you don't believe me, Here, you're an eyewitness. We are MythVision. I hope you enjoyed the intro, everybody, and I did put her in the little intro there on the far right. You are, I think, the Horseman of Death,
which I'm completely fine with.
Awesome. Well, I'm glad
that
that
works
you are.
for me. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the title of this was something like "What the heck is up with Paul?" And I was watching some of the comments go by while we were seeing the intro. Something like, that's a valid question. He was high on opium. Those kinds of things. The problem with Paul, there are several things that I can say, and we didn't really game this out ahead of time. So feel free to jump in at any point, and I'll try to keep an eye on things that people say. But the thing with him is that it can be a little bit confusing because he has been imagined and reimagined. I mean, this is the case with a lot of things in early Christianity, but so many times, and particularly by people like Augustine. So in a time period that's pretty close, actually, relatively speaking, to when his letters were being preserved and circulated, and he was being fashioned as something like a founding figure for early Christianity. And so what has happened to him as a figure, what's happened to his letters, is that he has basically been blamed for a lot of things, I think, that are representative of later interpretation of what he was trying to say. To some extent, you could argue he hasn't really been taken on his own terms. So you have the problem of his letters, interpretation of his letters, the way that other people have interpreted him, and that's perpetuated. So things like he's obsessed with sin, or attributing those kinds of things to him. We can talk more about that. The other problem you have is something like Acts of the Apostles, which essentially became almost like the sequel to the Gospels, but one that foregrounds Paul in a lot of ways. It's almost like his hero story. Tries to make all of these historical connections and give sort of this backstory to this guy, and we can't be certain about most of that. So things like, who his teachers were. I mean, even the idea that he's from Tarsus, sure. But that's not something he ever tells us, right? So to the extent that we can recreate who this guy was or try to understand him again on his own terms, we're in a tricky spot because we have the weight of the interpretation on one side, the bio that gets attributed to him on the other.
And the baggage that we bring to trying to figure him out, right?
Yeah, and like he's often read. You have a couple of layers here too of problematic evidence. His letters are often called the term that scholars use is occasional letters, or I don't know, you can call it maybe occasional evidence in the sense that it's one side of a conversation. He's writing a letter. We don't have the letter that was written to him or that he's responding to. And so you have kind of that one-sided conversation aspect. But then in a context where people are hearing him maybe say in church, there's a lot of stuff that does not get read in church from Paul's letters, and for good reason, because a lot of it's kind of, like it's not good for a sermon, say, or, like a passage here or there out of context. You have an additional, like distance from whatever the original context was, and then it being read in a context where you don't really know what's going on, why he's bringing up what he's bringing up necessarily, because it's being used for other purposes. So
we're kind of working backwards too, to try and are we, as critical scholars, is it wrong of us to go to the Gospels and try to pretend that we can parse out Paul? I think so. But when we look at Paul's letters as someone who is, I mean, you're a classicist, so you're like, You know how to look at the classics, the Greco-Roman world, and in which these letters come up in, which you recently, well, not too long ago, when you were on before, talking about how the Gospels were written possibly by educated elites in some sense. I'm wanting to kind of picture that as we have this canon, right? And trying to get to Paul. Like, what is this guy doing when these elites are using Paul? Mark is, whoever this Mark person, really, whoever the author
at the least.
Yeah, like, is what is going on? Why are they using Paul? Maybe is a question, and then we can get into Paul and maybe what you've learned. We can't talk about everything because there's a little sneak peek about something you're publishing soon about Paul and the moon and 1 Corinthians 15 and whatnot, just to tease people. But what do we do? Let's start with one question at a time in terms of this, and then we'll get to super chats once we're done having our little fun on Paul.
Okay, so here, let's do this. Let me tell you a little bit about what do we know about this guy.
Okay.
And what do we think he was doing? And that kind of sets the historical landscape. And then we can think about canon and we can think about how he was used. So what we know about this guy is that he is highly educated relatively in the ancient world. So he's part of what's often called a retainer class. So he's not super elite, but he's kind of like right here. And we know this basically not by too much of what he says, although a little bit about what he says about himself, but we can see it in the letters themselves. It's sort of its own piece of evidence in terms of his references, his mastery of language, his use of rhetoric, his understanding of philosophy, his understanding of the Hebrew Bible. Now, I say Hebrew Bible instead of Old Testament because I want to be, respectful of what that material is outside of Christianity. But he's reading what's called the Septuagint. So he's reading the Hebrew Bible, not in Hebrew, but he's reading it in Greek. He's a native Greek speaker. That's very clear. And he's been educated at the level of what we usually call progymnasita. So he's had a fair amount of schooling, and he tells us he's a Pharisee. So he's a teacher, more or less, or an interpreter of the Hebrew Bible, again, in Greek. And what that means, though, here's another one of those anachronistic, tricky things where we have later people like the rabbis claiming a legacy or a tradition that they themselves come from the Pharisees. And they tell us a little bit about that history. But somebody in the first century outside of Judea who's claiming they're a Pharisee, it's not exactly clear what that life would have been like. But more or less, he seems to be a worker for the aristocracy or for more elite persons. When he talks about persecuting early Christians, what we might call early Christians or Christ followers before he has his conversion, and those are terms we should talk about too, that seems to be kind of like what he would do for a career. He interprets the Hebrew Bible. He kind of is a bag man, maybe, or he's, like he's working for the higher ups. What persecute or I think pursue, sometimes people use different words for what he was supposed to be doing. It's imagined that he's killing early Christians, but I think that's maybe going a little too far. So he's had, a good education. He's used to doing these kinds of interpretations of the Hebrew Bible. He is very skilled in Greco-Roman philosophy, what we might call Greco-Roman philosophy, but specifically Plato. He knows Plato really well. He seems to know some Stoicism, at least to some extent. And because he's been educated in this, Greco-Roman way, he's utilizing that in the way that he's trying to convince the Gentiles, the non-Jews that he's writing to in these letters, of his positions. So that's basically the extent of what we know. I know a lot of people will say things like he knows Hebrew or he knows Aramaic. He knows enough to like quote a couple of words.
Yeah,
right?
I know a little Spanish or something. Yeah,
exactly. Like, sometimes, but like, can you, write in that language? Can you? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So
I know how to spell certain words from taking a few classes in high school.
I live in Miami,
you have
right?
to.
Right.
Yeah. I lived in Puerto Rico for 3 years, so I know a little bit, but I never really.
So yeah, that kind of functional knowledge, right. Maybe he had, but he's educated, like his native tongue is Greek. So that's basically what we know about his background. In terms of how he got messed up in all of this, this Jesus business, here's where the Augustine point that I was making before kind of comes in. So, once you have later understandings of firm distinctions between Judaism and Christianity, this idea that he converts from Judaism to Christianity becomes common. Now, there's a lot of reasons for that. Some are more pernicious than others. Ideas sort of superseding Judaism, things like that. That over the years are a factor in this. But really, in his age, he's Jewish. He's a Jewish Pharisee. He's speaking to Gentiles, but in his mind, what he says is that he basically thinks he's a prophet. He thinks he's a Jewish prophet who has been designated by the Israelite God to continue in this line of other prophets. And so when he's talking to Gentiles, he's using Greco-Roman philosophy and terms and ideas because he grew up with them. But he never deviates from the idea that he himself is Jewish, Jesus is Jewish, this is a Jewish movement. What he thinks is that, his understanding of the origins of the problem that Jesus becomes the solution to is that everybody in the beginning was basically a child or under the Jewish God. But Gentiles deviated. They moved away from the Jewish God. They started worshiping idols. They started worshiping the wrong things. So God designates Abraham as this father to become, this originator of a new generation or generations of a new people who are devoted to the Jewish God. But he also understands that prediction to say that those Gentiles, those people who have deviated, will come back. And in the fullness of time and at the end of time, there's going to be an event. And this is actually something, this idea of, eons kind of ending. The Stoics have this too. So this is not unique to Judaism, but the idea that there's going to be some kind of end time where a certain number of these Gentiles who, in the beginning sort of deviated away, and that was the reason for Abraham, the reason for these other prophets to continue this kind of course of history. That particular history of human beings is going to end. And Jesus is the marker of the beginning of that. Because Jesus, who he often calls Christ Jesus, the anointed one, he, he's crucified, he dies, he's resurrected by God and given God's spirit, or pneuma. And the fact that he's resurrected, death is considered one of the great evils of the world. And so since this, Jewish messianic apocalyptic figure is going to come and wipe out all the evils of the world, including what's called, like the archons is the word often used, sort of like the earthly rulers. You might imagine the Roman imperial system being kind of in the bullseye of that. But the greatest evil that everyone faces is death. And Jesus defeats death. So that's how, once the resurrected Jesus appears to Paul, he knows that this is the real deal. So the idea of the conversion, he doesn't convert from Judaism to Christianity. He sees the risen Christ and says, like, oh, I know the Hebrew Bible. I know what's supposed to happen. I know the scriptures. The first great evil has been defeated. God has chosen Christ Jesus to be that figure who's going to usher in this new age. He's the Messiah. And he must have picked me to be the prophet that tells everybody about it, because somebody has to tell the Gentiles, again, the ones who have fallen away, who have to come back into the fold before the end time. Somebody needs to do that work. Peter and James, they're not going to do it, right? Like Peter and James make it clear they're carrying on whatever was going on in Jerusalem. So Paul takes that on. So he's going to appeal to these Gentiles, explain to them the significance of Christ, explain to them the predictions in the scriptures, and then try to bring them into the fold of this Jewish movement in order to either A, do so before the end time scenario, because he's been tasked with this by God, or B, do so in order to bring about that end time scenario where Jesus will, as I say, come, I think of David Bowie, like the star man's going to come down from the sky.
And that's what Paula Fredrickson, wrote a book, Paul the Pagan's Apostle, on the same topic. Yeah, I think there's so many interesting things that you have said in this. And like, you just say it so smooth and very concise. I think that's what makes you unique. And when I've had you on before, you did the same thing. When you explain these things, I'm like, you just like unpacked Paul so eloquently. Everybody stop writing books about Paul. We figured it out now. Like it just seems like it's that easy. Because that's what
no, go ahead.
No, because I've been reading variations of Paul and I get it. we can flex on a certain text, we can flex on a certain thing and get caught up. Was Paul against the Torah, or was Paul, saying it has no use anymore, or is it only for Gentiles that he's saying don't?
Explain that too.
Hey, I know you can. That's why I know. You know what? Have fun. I'll be back in 2 hours. I'm just kidding.
No, but I mean, like, what I would say is, like, one thing that I try to do is, I don't know everything that tends to be said about the Gospels or Paul, and kind of, like, one of my things is that I try not to get too bogged down by contemporary theology, because then, of course, like, then you have that additional problem of when you're trying to read the ancient text in context, you have, all of this other kind of interpretation that's often very convincing, and so I'm trying to make sure I maintain a certain kind of professional distance from later theology.
Right.
But one thing that I do know some of the ways that these letters have been interpreted, or he's understood, Paul is understood. So when I give that description that I just gave, I am trying to kind of hit on the points that I think often come up for people in their own understandings or biography or interpretation of Paul. As for the law, that's a big one.
I knew you were going to do it.
Yeah, no, and that's related to Augustine too, because often there's this idea like, well, Paul is about law versus works.
Right.
That was a very Lutheran idea as well later on. And so, this is where you had stereotypes about Judaism being legalistic, or like too focused on the law, or too focused on I kind of like I don't want to get into all the stereotypes, but I think I've covered it. Whereas Paul, is updating things, and now it's all about like what you do, and it's not about following the law. That's not exactly what Paul is saying, actually. That's really more of again, Augustine Lutheran kind of later interpretation. What Paul is saying is, okay, God created this covenant with his people, and he's done so through Abraham. He did so through Moses. Again, all these other Jewish figures. So it's kind of been, over the course of time, this has been established with his people. And part of that was the law. When he says the law, he means the first 5 books of Moses. And in the law, you have basically guidelines on how to live a moral life or an ethical life, because we're mortal, we're weak. This is where the idea that Paul's all about sin. He's about missing the mark, which is really what the word in Greek for sin means. But we're susceptible to these things. We have passions, we get sick, we die. We're what did Kristen Stewart call us? Hold on. She called us something like pleasure bags. I loved that. I was exactly like, what? Some people understand what I'm talking about here. But we are just susceptible to all of these things, to the passions, to kind of our innate instincts. So the law is there in part to help identify the ways that we tend to sort of fall away from an ethical way of living. Now, this is not exclusive to Judaism. This is something too, by the way, that this is what all the philosophers are obsessed with as well, the Greek philosophers and Roman philosophers. But the law is there to point those things out. And the law was there as a covenant, again, between God and his people. Now, there's a new covenant, according to Paul, that is being established through Christ Jesus. And so because of everything I just described, Jesus dies, he resurrects, because of his faithfulness, Jesus's faithfulness in God's plan, he goes through with it. He gets crucified. He's rewarded with the resurrection, more or less. He defeats death. He's given a spiritual body, a pneumatic body by God that is no longer susceptible to all of those mortal frailties. And that is what those Gentiles who now establish through Jesus, it's a new covenant with the Gentiles. And those Gentiles that accept this, who are brought into the fold of this movement that Paul is describing, are going to share in that. There are different ways that he describes this. Sometimes he calls it participating in Christ, which we can talk more about. I'm sure it'll come up again. Just ideas of being in Christ. You see that all through his letters. So the Gentiles who get baptized, who participate in Eucharist, who participate in all of the things that he outlines, are going to share in that spirit, in that pneuma, and they can expect to also resurrect. They can expect to have the same, pneumatic body that Christ got. they can expect to live in that like idyllic afterlife scenario that seems to be promised by this idea of a Messiah coming and basically starting a new world order. And so that is the new covenant between God and these Gentiles being brought back in. But the old covenant, quote unquote, the law, that original covenant between God and his people, that's still valid. It's still there. So the Jewish people still have their covenant, but now these Gentiles have a new covenant. And you hear Paul talk about the new covenant quite often. And so you have two kind of mechanisms here for tying two different groups of people to the Jewish God. What gets confusing is that he often talks about the law in terms that we might consider, not derogatory, but, he'll be like, oh, well, the law was here, but now we have this new thing, right? It's that kind of dichotomy, rhetorical dichotomy, that gets us in trouble. But he always says the law is spiritual. The law is good. The law served its purpose. It's almost like the law was a babysitter, right? And continues to be valid because it's still pointing out to us the ways in which we can falter, ways in which...
Isn't this where Paula Fredrickson will say stuff like, when you hear that, right, people who think Paul's antinomian and anti-law and he's trying to get rid of it, whereas more older scholarship was on that Paul was doing this. Now it's Paul within Judaism school. So now they're like, hold on, what if Paul's saying these things to a Gentile audience? And the whole purpose rhetorically is to get them to run away from going to that covenantal law and join the Christ law, this whole thing. But where I get the real question mark that comes up is Paul acts like in Galatians, he sounds like he is no longer, it sounds like he's part of this new law. Whereas, isn't he a Jew?
Yeah, like 2 to 4, he's kind of like, Moses wrote on stone, but I'm writing on your heart. Like he does. That's why I'm saying there's like kind of a rhetorical dichotomy there.
Yeah.
That gets us in trouble. But he always comes back to the law is spiritual. The law is still good. The thing that is problematic about it, this comes up in Romans 2 as well, where he says, like, the law keeps pointing out to me how I suck. Right? Like, I don't know, but like the problem with the law is like it's not possible to follow it because no human being can follow it. But we keep trying to be good. We try to be ethical and we try to follow the law to the letter because we're trying to obey God, and we know that this is there again as kind of like a roadmap to how to live an ethical life, but nobody can follow it. It's just not possible. And so then it just makes me like self-conscious that it shows me like all the ways that I sin like on the daily, and it makes me feel bad about myself. That's no good. But guess what? We're going to resurrect either because we've been following the law as God's people, as Jews, or because we're part of this new covenant as Gentiles. And so, it's going to all kind of wash out in the end, right? Like if you've been an observant Jew and tried to follow the law, you're going to still be one of God's people. If you are a Gentile who participates in Christ, you will also be one of God's people. But he does not think that these new Gentiles need to follow, say, dietary laws. They don't need to circumcise, right? So the other thing to keep in mind that you're kind of highlighting here is that he's not the only game in town, as I like to say. He's got a lot of other people, whether he calls them super apostles, we don't know what that means, or he just calls them opponents. A lot of them also seem to be Jewish, who are saying, and this happens in Galatians, they are saying you need to follow the law. You need to circumcise. I think Galatians is the one where he says, if you circumcise and listen to these other a-holes, I hope the knife slips. Right?
Yes.
Like he says
our favorite part in Paul. Yeah.
He has a lot of good lines, but that one, that one's pretty good.
I hope he cut the whole thing off.
Yeah, exactly. Like I hope, because he knows there are these other competitors out there who have a slightly different message. Maybe, and this would explain a lot, maybe they don't have the education that he has. They still also, subscribe to this idea that Christ Jesus is the Messiah, but they weren't trained in progymnasita. They don't know the Greco-Roman world as well in terms of the philosophy, the logic, the references, etc. Right? Mm-hmm. So they say to become part of this movement, you must follow the law. But Paul doesn't. There are a lot of people scholars, maybe I shouldn't say a lot, but there are scholars who speculate like, well, maybe that's why Paul's a little bit more successful. He writes it down, and also you don't have to follow the law. Like you have a new covenant. You don't have to worry about the dietary laws. You don't have to circumcise. Can you imagine circumcising as a male adult?
No, I'm like, that gets into all sorts of other things. Yeah, no, I'm afraid of anything like that. So, especially,
I mean, without painkillers, without like,
I'm afraid
of a little
bit of
neosporin, something.
Right. I'd be afraid of doing that even with that. Even if you put me to sleep, I'd still be like, oh, shoot.
I mean, these were, a lot of agricultural, like they knew how to castrate animals anyway. Like this is just not, this is another topic. It maybe wasn't that bad is my point. But
I got to give a shout out to your book real quick, because everyone can tell you a thing or two. Okay. So please go get her book. Your book in particular, I don't want to get lost on that, but this is like a shameless plug in the midst of our Paul here. The origins of early Christian literature contextualized in the New Testament within Greco-Roman literary culture. In this, you talk about how we need to kind of get rid of the romanticizing or oral tradition approach. Not saying there weren't oral traditions, but it's like, this is not like a testable, observable phenomena that we can actually try to find out what the criteria of the Gospels is. And you're saying that it looks like Gospels are similar to what the Greco-Roman elites were writing in and competing in that kind of literature. You really need to get this book. Did I conceptualize that like in somewhat close or?
Yeah, definitely. So what I'm trying to argue in that book is that we spend a lot of time in the field trying to get back to the origins of Christianity and imagining that the Gospels, and this may be a little aspirational, are representative of an oral tradition that was passed on by generations after generations of early Christians and contains, we put in a lot of effort to figure out, what elements are historical. And to what extent they represent communities. So often you hear about the Markan community, the Matthean community, the Lucan community, and this idea that the Gospels and anything that they share in terms of literary material must be representative of a shared oral tradition. That strategically works very well for achieving that goal of coming up with some kind of origin for Christianity. What I point out in the book is that that seems to be a very, as you referenced, romantic idea. And I actually mean that not only in our kind of colloquial sense of romantic, but it's a methodology for approaching the Gospels that I identify goes back to the Romantic period. So 17th, 18th, 19th century, when that was a way that a lot of people approached the ideas of literature in general, that authors can be literate spokespersons for whole elements of culture or whole peoples. And when you look at the way that Greek and Roman literature was produced in the ancient world, that's not usually how we describe these things. We don't talk about, I think I give the examples in the book of like Virgil's community or, Philo's community. We don't usually attribute literature to communities. And so I go through the book and try to demonstrate that what you have, I don't think, is the evidence of shared oral traditions, but actually three authors in the Synoptic Gospels in particular, where people are exchanging literature. They're exchanging texts, and individual authors are actually trying to come up with their own best version of the story. And you can see other elements throughout the Gospels that are shared in Greco-Roman literature broadly. So I point out that there are elements of the Gospels, that stories even about things like the Last Supper or the crucifixion, that are in texts like the Satyricon. So I kind of go through and or in things like biographies of Plutarch. Now, the idea that the Gospels share things in common with other kinds of literature, like ancient biography or the Greek novel, or even philosophy, things like that, that's not new. But when you think about it in the context of the Gospel authors as normal authors in the ancient world who are just writing stories, it, I think, shifts that frame from imagining the Gospels as these, representative of an oral tradition and a literate spokesperson who's just recording the stories of the church about the historical Jesus. It shifts that frame. And I tried to point out that actually these authors are just kind of writing another story in the ancient world.
I do want everybody to go down in the description. The book is down there. Please get you a copy. I will come back to this at the end of our episode for sure. And then also, if I may, I want
Yeah.
everybody to also check out MythVision's Patreon. I work very hard. Please consider joining us there. I mean, this is a middle of the episode, just plug. Working very hard. Every month I get, people who come and go, and it's hard to keep the numbers up. I am trying to do new things, trying to, keep growing what I'm doing here. But I had one video, like a clip, if I could, to play for you, that I kind of think of Paul in, right? Because I've had these conversations where, did Paul believe there was a historical Jesus? He doesn't really care to talk much about Jesus's actual life. And this is a few questions before we get to the super chats. I am going to get to the super chats. We could do one on historical Jesus in the future, but just like, did Paul think there was a guy? And did Paul learn anything from the previous community? Because he talks about, I got my gospel from no human source, Galatians. He loves to do that. And I think he probably did get some of this stuff from earlier people, especially if he says he's persecuting them, whatever that even means. I don't necessarily think it means kill, but I think it could mean
annoying.
Yeah, there's a problem. He's reporting them. He's trying to get them in trouble, whatever it might be. So let me play the Passion Translation for those who aren't aware. Brian Simmons is a modern guy who translates the Bible, right? And let's hear how he describes this. And tell me if you think Paul's kind of working in the same gist here. Thank you, Stephen, my buddy Stephen, for introducing this little clip to me. Here we go.
Of that miracle.
Okay, 2009. Brian Simmons gets a new assignment. What happened?
Jesus Christ came into my room. He breathed on me. And he commissioned me.
When he breathed on you, I have to ask you this. What did it feel like?
Good question.
It felt like a kiss from heaven. It felt like heaven's wind, the ruach, the breath, the wind of God that came upon me. And he spoke to me and said, I'm commissioning you to translate the Bible into the translation project that I'm giving you to do. And he promised that he would help me, and he promised me he would give me secrets of the Hebrew language.
It's starting to sound like Paul, but we're not done yet. Just wanted to tease you.
Do you believe he blew on you? There was an impartation for revelation.
I do. I believe the spirit of revelation was given. And I have to say, when he breathed on me, in no way would I want to compare that to...
So he goes to say, I don't compare it to the canon, because of course that's going to get him in a hot seat with Christians. But he wants to make sure he sells his version of this translation that God imparted on him by breathing upon him. Paul says he got his gospel from no human source, from no man, from scripture and revelation. But does that mean he learned nothing about Jesus, but direct scripture and revelation? Or did Paul learn about Jesus probably from Cephas, the list in 1 Corinthians 15, or these other people he's persecuting? What makes more sense?
I think he thinks he's getting it from the risen Christ. That's what he describes. So he described, I mean, even, I know just full disclosure, you texted me right before this thing. You wanted to talk about the Last Supper.
I did.
So I can bring that in here. So this is a good example of what I think is going on. He keeps talking about how he has what you might call divination experiences, or these revelatory experiences where the risen Christ is appearing to him and telling him stuff. Now, one of the things, among the things that the risen Christ tells him is about the last meal that he had with his followers before his crucifixion. And this is not coming from anybody who was there, other than the risen Jesus telling him these things. He's basically doing what you just showed in that clip. Someone saying, he appeared to me, he told me this. Now, think about why he has to do this. Okay, like let's grant that he thinks this is happening. Okay, whatever. I don't, psychologically sure, cognitively sure, something like that seems to be happening to him. But also, if you think about it as a strategic measure, and I'm not attributing, this to him in some kind of cynical way, but as strategy, this guy was not there, right? Paul was not there. In fact, he tells us he has a very different background to this whole Jesus movement, where he, was formerly again persecuting. Why would anybody listen to him if he's not one of the people who is there or was there? And I think it's because he can claim, well, sure, James and Peter were there, but Jesus talked to me more recently. Like, yeah, you knew the guy, but who cares about whether or not you knew the guy? Like, what matters is Christ Jesus. What matters is the resurrected Jesus. And that's the guy who's coming to me because I'm the prophet chosen by God to bring the Gentiles into the fold so that the end time comes and that we can fulfill, this destiny. And so as a matter of strategy, to be an apostle who's a member of this group, to have any kind of authority, he claims authority in various ways. One is that he is a Pharisee, so he understands the scriptures really well. But the other is that he's talking to resurrected Jesus on the regular. You know what I mean? Like he's been chosen to receive this intel from the risen Christ and to communicate it. And that gives him authority that you can argue even supersedes that of Jesus's followers, those that we know are still alive. Does that make
No,
sense?
I get it. Yeah, I always thought when I read 1 Corinthians 11 in that place on the night he was handed over.
Yeah.
This happens before. I was thinking maybe Paul picked up on this from earlier Christians. Is what I was thinking, because he lists earlier Christians in that 1 Corinthians 15.
Yeah.
It's like he appeared to them. Like I imagine this appear may mean Paul's trying to say, hey, I got similar. I'm the most up to date, and I worked harder than all of them. Of course, he has to add that caveat after he lists them.
Of course.
But it seemed like to me he's kind of trying to imply, like, hey, look, on the night he was handed over. And I asked that question because in the mythicist model that says Jesus didn't exist at all and he was only a heavenly figure, which means they say that they believe Paul and then believed he existed, but only in heaven. Never did he come to earth. I thought maybe the night that he was handed over passage might have implied here is something that Paul's picking up on, maybe from earlier Christians, and there's a ceremonial meal. But do you think Paul is the one who's coming up with the ceremonial meal for Jesus? Okay. Yeah. Now, what do we do about those who he appeared to before Paul? Like, would you say it's the same kind of appearance? Or is Paul making this up to add to his credentials? Or
I mean, like he talks about the Jerusalem Council too. Like he links himself with the movement. He's just establishing himself as a different figure in a different key, but he is signaling some kind of, overall movement. He's not denying that. But I think he's giving himself some kind of authority through different means. You see what I mean?
Got it.
So the reason I say to you, this Last Supper, which is not what it was called, but we know what we mean when we say Last Supper. But the reason I point that out is an example of this idea of, he says, like, well, Jesus came to me. Sometimes I say this to my students. I don't mean to sound too flippant, but I sometimes say zombie Jesus just to designate, like the resurrected Jesus from the historical Jesus. So when he says, zombie Jesus told me about this meal, and then it appears later on in the Gospels, what that signals to me is that the Gospel writers read Paul more so than, it's quite possible, to your point, that there was some kind of, and if you read, I have, which I brought a Bible just in case, I have the HarperCollins here. Hallelujah. If you look at, if you read like the notes when you get to a passage about the Last Supper, it'll say like, oh, here are all the cross references. And it'll say that, well, there must have been an oral tradition from the beginning of the Jesus movement that made it to Paul and then made it to each community of the gospel writers. So that must mean it's true. Because it's like you can't conceptualize or there's a resistance to the idea that Paul just made it up, right? Like that Paul, or this was a divination experience, whatever validity you want to give to a divination experience, but it's quite possible he just had a divination experience where Jesus told him this took place.
Well, this, if I may, I got a jab. This is fun. So for me, Brian Simmons, right? The guy we just saw the video on, who talked about, and the Lord he breathed on me and it felt like a kiss from heaven. And look, the guy may or may not have had an experience. I don't rule it out. And I don't say he didn't. People have it. The human brain and humans are weird.
That's kind of what I was saying before when I was like, sure, it happened. That's not my job.
Right.
Give him an MRI. It's not.
But I wanted to like ask you, being someone who's aware of Paul and the Greco-Roman world, he's not an idiot. He knows there are mystery cults out here that are part of religious systems. It's not like the cult is different from the religion. The cult kind of is emphasizing, here's the mythological story of Isis, Osiris, or whatever it might be, Dionysus.
Sure.
He knows. And I'm thinking to myself, is Paul this guy who's engaging in the Gentile world? He sees this. Some of these people are probably members of these mystery religions. And here he is going, oh, guess what? Jesus also had, but this is the true one, has a meal as well. The Jerusalem Council probably didn't do that, I think.
Well, I mean, it's possible, but I mean, this is one of those things where it would be awfully hard to decisively reconstruct, right? So I'm just dealing with what I see in the letters and kind of, you know, Occam's razor, like what makes the, like, if I'm just taking everything at face value, you know, like what is being communicated here. You know, the thing is, I might have mentioned this last time, so I apologize if I'm sort of repeating myself, but, you know, some of it's a little bit later, 2nd century, but we have a lot of accounts, and the one that's popping into my head at the moment is Lucian, about a couple of things. One is somebody like Lucian who's writing satire, so you have to take it with kind of a grain of salt because he's trying to be funny, basically. Right. But he describes other figures who are competing with each other in what we might call kind of this Greco-Roman system, where they're claiming that they are basically channeling the Greco-Roman gods. And so the one that comes to mind for me is this guy named Alexander, who was supposed to be channeling the god Glycon. And so he would do all kinds of things, like he would write like little predictions, you know, for people. He would write them in meter and sell them. Or people would come to him, and he had a snake puppet. This is why I like this guy. He would set up a tent, and he had a little snake puppet that had like a little, like it was like a I can't say this word.
I know what you mean. I know what you mean.
Yeah. So you know, like people would line up and pay money to come in to like ask a question about their lives, and he had like this little like ventriloquist, like, you know,
what
snake
did you
puppet.
say?
Yeah, exactly. So like, but he was speaking for the god, and then he eventually he claims he had a daughter with the moon. And so he marries her off to a Roman senator who just happens to be bankrolling this whole thing. You know what I mean? Like, you have lots of examples. And again, you have to moderate your expectations with that kind of comparative evidence, because like in this case, Lucian is being like, look at this guy, you know, like he's not, but we know that guy existed because the emperor asked him questions. Like, he got popular enough, right? That like we have some evidence that, you know, independent of this kind of satirical treatment. So there are certainly people even in the ancient world who treat all of this stuff with a healthy dose of skepticism, let's say. Right. So you have lots of figures like that in the ancient world. And so I think, you know, Paul is just another one of these guys, mostly guys. And then the other thing about the meal is John Kloppenborg's recent book on Christ associations. What he does a nice job demonstrating in that book is that, you know, there weren't, I hope this, I'm not trying to say this is John's argument, this is kind of my summation of it, and it might be a little too simplistic, so I apologize in advance. But essentially what he's saying is, you know, there were no ancient, like fire departments. There were no ancient, like undertakers. When you had to have some kind of, you know, public works done, generally speaking, or something like taking care of a family after somebody's departed, you often needed some kind of group to help with that. And so when you have these associations, ecclesia, which is the word in Greek that we translate as church, ecclesia as a word existed well before Paul, because it represented these kind of social organizations that would band together. Usually it's because everybody was part of the same kind of profession, almost like a guild, or also almost like a union that would get together. Everybody would kind of contribute money, and there would be some kind of god as a spokesperson for it, a representative for that ecclesia. The god would be, so like, you know, we're the ecclesia for the fire department in Ostia, and our, you know, patron god is X, Y, and Z, right? Usually it would just be one or two. So Paul has that in mind too. You know, he chooses the word ecclesia. These people are supposed to be taking care of each other. They're supposed to be helping each other out. You know, like if there's a widow in the community, community. If there's, you know, somebody who needs to be buried, like everybody bands together, everybody's kind of paying their dues. Part of those associations, you had communal meals. We know this. There were like receipts, right? Like other ecclesia for other purposes. People would get together, like somebody would donate like the donkeys to bring in the food. Like we have evidence for this, and Kloppenborg's done a nice job showing this. So the idea that Paul would be like, we need to have like a family meal. Jesus came to me and said, you know what? I did that right before I died. You know, his death is really big and important in this movement. So, you know, we're going to replicate the meal he just told me about. Everybody pull your money together. You know, we're going to share in this Eucharistic meal, you know, as part of this participation in Christ. We're going to share in this meal. We're going to baptize. This is how you're going to receive God's pneuma. That's how you're going to be one of the group. We're going to help one another out. You know, we're going to share in Christ's pneuma. We're going to be in Christ. And that's what's going to bound us together while we wait for this end time scenario to take place. So it just is a normal kind of social behavior to me. It's not super unique in the group. Do you see what I mean? Like it's not.
Absolutely. I have one question. I'm going to shut up after this. I want our super chats. Super chat your questions. We'll get into those. I really appreciate you being patient with me. We're having a blast. I really wanted you to kind of give us.
I'm also talking too much today. I've had too much tea.
No. This is good. Trust me. I'm talking too much because you should do all the talking, honestly. Paul, when he says Christ was buried, he's crucified, buried, right? People die on this little buried. Well, buried means, look at Mark, in a tomb. And then others will say, no, that historically would have never happened. If he was a criminal, he'd have been left up on a cross and rotted, even though maybe there were certain special laws that Rome allowed Judea to kind of potentially, I don't know. My point is Bart Ehrman thinks he died and rotted on a cross, I guess. Others think he had like a burial that was like a criminal burial. And then there's me who comes in, and I'm not any of these, but I think I'm like, okay, let me weigh out the evidence and think about it. Hero cults are always associated with tombs. Here you have these high epic type tales that talk about tombs in the Gospels. Does Paul think in some sense like these cult demigod gods, whatever, that this burial is like that? Is his Christ a hero epic type of figure? Or is he like, hey, he literally got killed by Romans. He literally was buried in some way. He doesn't even care to emphasize how, but he resurrected, because the point is he's alive now, and he's alive, and we are alive in him, and we'll never die with his pneuma or whatever. What's up with the burial thing, though? How do you interpret that?
Well, I actually interpret it alongside what I was just saying in terms of this idea of participation in Christ, because he often goes out of his way to be like, you know, this is what I'm promising. You know, to become part of this group, he's making a big promise, which is, you know, you're going to receive a pneumatic body that never gets ill or dies and lives forever. That's pretty good. And, you know, that's kind of, it's a big ask. It's a big ask for someone to be like, oh, yeah, okay, I'm going to, you know, again, this is not something that these particular Gentiles are born into so that they've heard this narrative their whole lives, right? Like this is something new to them. So it's not, you know, native to their thinking necessarily. So it's possible he's doing something like you say, you know, appealing to some idea of hero cult or something like that. The only reason I resist that to some extent is because he tends to be more of a philosopher. I don't see a lot of evidence of the hero cult in Paul. I could be wrong about that. But I think we tend to sometimes too in modernity, because of distance, sort of merge Roman and Greek as if it's one thing, and it's very, very different.
Right, because that's a Greek idea. I get it.
Yeah, but you know, at the same time, Paul is really in Western Asia and Greece, and so yeah, maybe regionally that would have made a lot of sense. In something like 1 Corinthians, 15:4. Or something like that, where he talks about buried. I think it's right at the beginning of 1 Corinthians 15.
Right.
He just kind of names it, if I remember correctly, in like a list. Like, you know,
right.
He always talks about like, and we're going to die with him. Like in all the list of the things that we're going to do with Christ, we're going to resurrect with him. We're going to die with him. You know, we eat with him in this meal. We do X, Y, Z, and die and bury. Like these are all the ways that we participate in Christ in the way, you know, that we're all part of the same unit. And so to me, when he says, and he died and he was buried, that's what's going to happen to all of us. right? And so it's almost like he's acknowledging that, that this is the human condition. You know, at the time he's writing Corinthians, people are dying who are a part of this group, and the other people in the group are like, you know, like, you said he was coming back.
Right. So now he has to backpedal and make sense of that. And, well, you know, when he comes, those of us who are alive and remain at his coming will be.
Yeah, because he talks about the people who are buried who are going to rise, right? You know, he has to address these issues because they're issues within, you know, the groups of Gentiles he's writing to. You know, like what's going to happen. He talks about baptism of the dead, I think, isn't that in 1 Corinthians, right? So
yeah.
This is a pressing issue in these, again, the nature of the occasional letter. We have to reconstruct what the problems were that they're coming to him with. And, you know, Corinthians have a lot of problems. We can talk about the Corinthian problems. But, you know, in 1 Corinthians 15, he's really getting into like, okay, let me break this down for you. This is what you can expect. And so when he says, you know, like he was crucified, he died, he was buried, those are the things, you know, that are going to happen this is how we're all participating in Christ, to me.
Thank you. Yeah. I think there's so much that could be said too about that whole participation. Like, here is the script of what happened to Jesus. We need to follow that script. By baptism, you are buried. We're going to resurrect, of course, with the pneuma, the spirit that comes into you. You're also going to rise. So here's this like prescript that you need, that you're going to also mimic. He doesn't go into the details. He just doesn't give you what the Gospels do, is something completely different.
Oh, yeah. And, you know, I wrote about that in the book a little bit, where, you know, why put him in a tomb? Well, you know, like in the Greek novel, there are empty tombs all the time to symbolize, in the Satyricon, the same thing. You know, it symbolizes a change in ontological status. You are no longer mortal. You have become divine. You know, there's, is it Keraton maybe? If that's wrong, my apologies, because I didn't reread it before coming. But there's one that I quote, one of the Greek novels, where the main protagonist, you know, is looking for his lost love. He thinks that she's dead in a tomb. It's a very Romeo and Juliet kind of story. And he goes into the tomb. You know, she was, of course, alive and pirates took her. This might be Calaroe. And he goes in, and the first thing he says when he sees that her body is missing is like, oh, what God came and took her, you know, to make her a goddess now, like up in heaven. Like that was the, you know, apotheosis, right? Like, so to symbolize the change in ontological status of someone from mortal to immortal, their body has to go away. And there are so many examples in the ancient world. And to the extent, you know, that I have argued that the Gospels represent strongly what, you know, a little sloppily we might call Greco-Roman literature, but literature that's popular in the 1st and 2nd centuries, to the extent that it represents and mirrors that kind of practice and that content. The idea that Jesus, you know, you would roll away the stone and the body would be gone. That's spot on. That's like, you know, I
hope the apologists are taking notes. Now we're going to super chats. I'm sorry for taking so long to get to this point. We're almost at an hour almost. Idiosyncrasy, thank you for the super sticker. I did not see a comment from you, my friend. Thank you so much, though, for the support. I really appreciate it. Doc Pleuromanot. Oh, snap. Doc's in the house. Ancient rhetoricians said good arguments are based on logos, pathos, and ethos. Paul exhibited few examples of personal emotion in his letters, box checking by relying on his hardships to evoke empathy in his readers.
Personal emotions, I think he does a fair amount. Now, this brings up some interesting questions about, you know, psychological profiles of our authors. You know, in Romans, he engages in something called prosopopoeia. And there are 2 scholars who have written about this quite convincingly. Stan Stowers and Emma Wasserman have written about this quite a bit. But he often takes on characters, and he'll speak. Prosopopoeia means speech and character. So he'll often say things like in Romans, I think it's around Romans 5 maybe, he'll say things like, oh, you know, why can't I follow the law? Like, why am I so bad at this? And then he'll be like, you know, like kind of do question and answer. But you get the sense there that he's describing through this rhetorical means a certain emotional state. It may not be one that we want to attribute to him as like a psychological profile, again, of the man. And so to that extent, I understand the question. You know, he isn't exactly demonstrating pathos in a way that seems confessional, but he talks about his own experiences. He uses those rhetorical moves to evoke emotion, to be convincing. He certainly shows anger. He has no problem with anger. Back to, you know, Galatians and threatening people with castration. So I think that, you know, he often will say things like, "You foolish Galatians." Like, I can't believe you. I think the only one letter I can think of where he's actually kind of not angry or doesn't get emotional in some ways, Romans, because he doesn't know them. You know, when he writes a letter to the Romans, he's heard about them, and he's been, again, kind of in West Asia and Greece, and he wants to go to Rome, and tradition holds that he makes it there, and that's kind of where his story ends. I think the church says that he's executed in Rome. We don't really know what happens to him. But when he writes to the Romans, he's like, here's my deal. Actually, when I teach Paul, I start with Romans, even though it's what some people call his mature theology. It's so later theology after, you know, about 15 years. It's like his intellectual CV, because he hasn't met them yet. And he's trying to convince them not only to pay for him to come to Rome, but to then pay for him to go to Spain. And so he's looking for sponsorship. And so he has to lay out, like, here's my deal. Wow. So that's the only one where I don't totally, like, he'll use something like prosopopoeia, that speech and character that has that emotional tinge to it. But otherwise, like, yeah, he shows emotion. He gets mad. He definitely gets mad.
Thank you so much for that. Gnostic informant, my buddy Neil, that you absolutely must get up with and do some interviews with. What are your thoughts on the writer of Acts claiming that Paul was raised at the feet of Gamaliel? I hope I pronounced his name right.
You know, that's one of those elements, like I was saying before, that fill in the biography of Paul, but probably serve later purposes. So, you know, I mentioned before, that Acts claims he's from Tarsus. Sure, maybe, except he only ever describes himself around Damascus. But, you know, it's one of those things like, yeah, maybe, probably has a different purpose to it that has more to do with whatever's going on in the 2nd century and beyond.
Neil, thanks for that super chat, my friend, and for being a member of our YouTube channel.
I'll email you back.
Yeah. Doc Pluromana, thank you for the super chat. Acts 15:15. James argues for Peter's baptism of non-Jews and cites Simeon, and the rare verb symphonio is used with the prophets, Amos, a blatant refutation of Paul's redefinition of Israel and advocating for James' Davidic restoration. We didn't prep for this, Doc. Let me pull it up and just kind of read the passage, if that helps any. But obviously you need Greek and... Anyway.
I'm not sure what the question is. Hold on. That's on me. Blatant refutation of Paul's redefinition of Israel. Yeah, I would have to look at that passage. You know, that's one of those things that a scholar of Acts, you know, should really address, because I'm not a scholar of Acts, because I don't consider it historical right. at all. So whatever's going on in terms, okay, I'm pulling it up now. 15:15.
Yeah, but it's just a phrase.
Finish speaking, James replied, "My brothers, listen to me." Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So it's going back to what I was saying before. God first looked favorably on the Gentiles, and, you know, is trying to bring them back.
Right. From
I'm not
that point,
sure.
You were saying, like, they fell away long ago. After they finished speaking, James replied, "Brothers, listen to me. Simeon has related how God first visited the Gentiles to take from them a people for his name. And with this, the words of the prophets agree." So, okay, this is just dealing with that. Cornelius was just joining the movement. And I guess I'm trying to figure out what the point of the super chat is.
That's what I was saying. I'm not quite sure. Yeah, I'm not quite sure. It might just kind of be an assertion of the point, that, you know, the idea of Israel is going to include the Gentiles again. But that was always the case. That was always the purpose. You know, the Gentiles have fallen away and they have to come back. A blatant refutation of Paul's redefinition of it. So I think there, I'm not sure what's meant by Paul's redefinition of Israel. What I see going on in 15:15 is directly from Paul's letters.
Okay. Yeah, I just know Paul does some fishy stuff with the way he even uses the phrase in Galatians about Abraham, but it's also a common thing. I was reading a book, Cattell Berthelot. I don't know if you've heard of her. She wrote a book called Jews and the Roman Rivals, which I brag about a lot because I really enjoyed it. It's the idea that Jews were, even Jews, this wasn't a Christian thing. A lot of even Jewish apologists that I've had on who like to jab at Paul. Oh, he ruined, he's so anti, this and that. But like rabbis, Jewish rabbis and writers were already trying to redefine being an Abraham's descendant. And they were like, well, the term in the Bible is the Gentile or Goyim, right? So he'd be the father of many Goyim. Who are the Goyim? Duh, non-Jew. So like Abraham would be their fathers too. This is prophesied here in Genesis. And so they're already utilizing that language and redefining it for their contemporary audience, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, we're all God's people, and so just some have fallen away. And, Paul argues about this. I think it is actually in Galatians where he described, we're all children of Abraham, just some are from Sarah and some are from Hagar. And so he uses this to create this idea of, he talks about the adoption of the Spirit. These Gentiles just have to be adopted back into the line of Abraham. That's how he talks about it in his letters. And it doesn't mean that, but again, like this is predicted that they will come back. And he talks about those who participate in baptism and coming back, adopted by the pneuma, by the Spirit, back into that family tree of Abraham, as like kind of the legitimate heirs of the promise. When he talks about that, and he uses that kind of language, all of it is wrapped up in this idea that they are then going to be co-heirs with Christ, is what he says. Brothers in Christ. When he says brother and sister in the text, he's actually just using Adelphoi, so he's using just brothers. But the idea is that, Jesus receives that pneumatic body from God. He's an adopted son of God. Jesus is. This brings up the gospel question. When does Jesus actually become the Son of God? Is it like at the baptism that's described in the Gospels? Because in Mark, it kind of seems like he's just a dude until he's baptized, and then God's pneuma comes down and then makes him God's son, right? Whether or not Paul thinks that this was something predestined, I don't think so. Actually, I think Paul. I'd have to read around and think about this a little bit more. But like what's in my heart is that Paul thinks that, Jesus has been selected. Maybe he was somewhat, we might use the word like preordained to this position, kind of the way that I think Paul says well, I was going to be a prophet, like that was predetermined by God, like before my birth, right? Like he may have an idea of who is designated for these roles. He does not seem to have much of the like Mary Virgin kind of thing going on. So this idea that you can receive God's pneuma, and that's going to change again in Jesus's case, like his status as a son of God, but also his ontological status. That's the thing that people are participating in, the Gentiles, by becoming what he calls co-heirs with Christ. So you become a co-heir by being baptized because you receive that same pneuma. That pneuma is the stuff that turned Jesus into God's son. It's now going to turn you into an adopted child of Abraham. So that makes you like Jesus's brother. That means we're all brothers in Christ. Like, so you can see how the language, like all of that should sound vaguely familiar formulaically. But in the Greek, that's all very well established, those terms, and they've become formulaic to us, but it's part of his strategy of describing these things.
Thank you so much for that. Constellation Pegasus, in today's terms, could Paul be considered a cult leader then? Seems to be a suspect in Judaism and researchers on the Bible.
It's a very good question. The thing I struggle with a little bit, and it would be interesting to talk to other Pauline scholars about this, is to what extent Paul's so-called like apocalypticism should play in here. I think that, to me, it's a major factor. I think it's always the elephant in the room, that this end time is coming, it's coming. And then like his letters change as time goes on to accommodate that. The idea that he would be a cult leader sounds to me, therefore, a little bit too like established, if you know what I mean. Like the idea that we have to establish a cult and a hierarchy and a formal organization sounds like the activity of people who think that they're going to be around a while. And like certainly you have some talk of hierarchy and organization and social structure in Paul, but I think you also have the idea like things are a little bit fast and loose for Paul until you start to realize people are like running too far with it, like the Corinthians, and too much time is passing. And then you start, I call it in my classes, a domestication of Paul. You start to see that he gets, like, no, don't do that. Like you don't have the pneumatic bodies yet. Like, what are you doing? Don't go to the prostitutes or like whatever it is, right? Like you can't live like it's the end time already. You start to see him kind of like, no, you have to veil your head. Like, don't look like a weirdo. Like, he's trying to balance kind of this radical change he's promising with social expectation. And as time goes on, that aperture kind of keeps closing in on him a little bit. So to me, I'm not sure if he's trying to start a cult so much. Again, like I think he just thinks this is the fulfillment of the Jewish scriptures. And I think he thinks he's probably like the most aligned with the expectations. And if he truly believes he's seeing the resurrected Jesus and that he's a prophet, he thinks that he's doing the right thing in terms of fulfilling the destiny of the Jewish people by incorporating these Gentiles for that end time scenario. Where the idea of like cult leader may come in is to the extent that we bring in something like capitalist expectations, right? Which are just a fact of life. So back to thinking about, say, like Lucian and Alexander, that guy was definitely getting paid for what he was doing. Paul is not shy about, asking for support and taking it. That's pretty clear. He's not even writing his own letters sometimes. It seems like he may be dictating them. So somebody's doing that labor for him. And, he's looking for sponsorship. And so he still has to live, right? And again, it depends on how cynical you are. If you want to write the satire about Paul, then he's capitalizing on, this Christ cult that he was formerly persecuting and now trying to take it over, and set himself up, in counter to somebody like James and Peter and this more maybe kind of, we were talking about this at another point, like sort of upstart Jewish group within Jerusalem, right? Like he's establishing something very different and, using his experience and knowledge as a Pharisee. Yeah, you can make that. The truth is probably somewhere in between.
Right. Interesting. Yeah. There's so much. Thank you, Constellation, for the super chat. Battler, thank you for the super chat. Why would Paul not even show a little interest in learning about the life and teaching of Jesus Christ? Would that not be logical? Is there any ulterior motive in his trying to spread Christianity?
Does not help him at all to know anything about the historical Jesus. Does not help him in the slightest, really, because he didn't know him. And in the ancient world, like how can he validate any of his claims, about his knowledge if he's trying to trade on the idea of what that man said during his lifetime in an era when you can't, reconstruct. There are no pictures. There's no, Jesus didn't write anything down. Like there's nothing for him to go on in that respect to kind of establish his authority.
Is it fair to say that he may have known at least a teaching of Jesus dying, burying, resurrecting? Did that teaching precede him?
He does say some things about him. I should make a list someday because this comes up. But I remember the one that I often cite just because my joke. I need to get new jokes. But he does say that Jesus said, "Don't commit adultery," and I always joke, and that's the one everyone breaks. It's like the only one that the earliest. I'm joking, but like just that right. He says a couple of things along those lines, but it's just not what's pressing for him in these letters. Now, there's the question of what he means when he says that he has a gospel. But it seems that the letters themselves may represent that gospel. Like this is the good news, which is what the term means. And then it's used later on for these writings about the historical Jesus. So yeah, he has, I mean, this is where too, you know, I'm not along the lines of scholars who are like, oh, Jesus never existed. I mean, he clearly knows James and Peter. If you want to take that testimony, like there's knowledge of the life of Jesus. But it, you know, one thing that I've argued elsewhere is that the life and teachings of the historical Jesus don't seem to become particularly important to what we might consider the early church until after the temple is gone. And it's after the temple is gone that you start to see people being like, "What did that guy say?" You know, like, what happened? How do we understand Judaism without the temple? Because if you notice, Jesus's teachings don't require the temple.
So how do we
know
know that's really what Jesus, unless you want to try and put him into what, like a Qumran type of figure that's not needing a temple? They're already a diasporic type of Judaism, right?
And, you know, that can be an influence, certainly. But you have too, I mean, one thing I meant to bring up earlier is, you know, Paul's influence on the Gospels, I think, is immense, despite the fact that he doesn't talk about the historical Jesus, but because he lays that roadmap for things like the Last Supper. He lays that roadmap for what is ethical living, right? And, you know, how do we understand a new way to do Judaism, which Paul presents, and an evaluation of the Hebrew scriptures. The Jesus you get in the Gospels is very much, you know, we can talk more about this too if we ever do historical Jesus session.
We should.
But that there's a great knowledge of Greco-Roman philosophy in the teachings of that Jesus that you get in the Synoptic Gospels, especially. And again, Paul reflects that kind of knowledge as well. And so you're getting that, I think, from, and to put those all in canon together, create a cohesion, right? To put all those early letters and then put the Gospels together. But I don't think that's not Paul's problem. You know, like strategically as an authority figure, deferring to the historical Jesus doesn't do him any good. Right. He's a divination specialist, more or less. You know, interpreting the sacred scriptures of the Jewish people and channeling knowledge from this pneumatic figure in Christ. That's what he's doing. To go back to the historical Jesus doesn't serve the purpose of either the eschatological kind of pressure that's going on and in the moment as he describes it. And then later on, because he's separate from the movement in Jerusalem, it doesn't do him any good to refer back to that. He has no knowledge of it, really, except for what you're pointing out here. Maybe a few things here and there, a few teachings here and there. But other than that, no.
Thank you. Scott Duke says, theological question. Would Paul have had a plaster pig on his bookshelf? Hold on. You got one right behind you. So
I do. Where is it? Yeah. That's my piggy bank. For anybody who's noticed my backdrops, I like taxidermy and I like that kind of thing. And I got this actually at a museum on Miami Beach. So it's a mold of a dead piglet. Sorry. And it's a prized possession. It's my nice little.
Yeah. Thank you, Scott, for the super chat. Avaro says, did baptism of the dead have a pagan counterpart? And I'll tell you just a tease, like I read an article Richard Carrier recently did on he did it on Dying and Rising Gods, how there is a motif on the mythology.
That was written about that too, right?
Yeah, like in it, the Dionysus cult, he said they also had a practice where you could baptize them on behalf of the dead. But I didn't know if you knew of anything or if you were able to verify that or...
You know, the thing that came to mind, this is probably not helpful. The thing that comes to mind for me is libations for the dead. I mean, when you think about the way that, especially in Greece, you know, it's actually, here's a case where Greek and Roman, I think, does apply, but going to the sites of the dead and pouring libations, pouring oil, pouring water onto the graves for those, I mean, there's just such a long tradition in the ancient Mediterranean for this. and for, both nourishing the dead, but also, creating some kind of anointing process to be close to them. There isn't one tradition that necessarily jumps right out at me, but baptism it doesn't seem that strange to me that would take place. Yeah.
I was reading a book called Coming Back to Life, and I'm still reading that book. Actually, one of the scholars in it, I was asking you about when I was like, hey, do you know his email? But they have these like strange.
Yeah, Kaiser.
There's a porous line between the living and the dead, and they like would go out there and put food on a plate or whatever and like leave it out there at the grave. And they thought maybe the dead was hungry and they would eat some of it. But we even have today people who believe like if you leave water out on your windowsill, like the spirit of your loved one will come because they're thirsty and they'll be able to drink some of this. Like
we do it all the time. Yeah, we shouldn't treat the ancients like there are different kinds of memorials that people do, but there is an idea of trying to share with the dead, and also it kind of goes back to what I was saying about ecclesia. I'm teaching a deaf class in the fall, and I've taught it before. We're very separate from the process of death. We don't like bodily functions and modernity. We don't want to think about it. We don't want to think about death. Most of everything that we do on a day-to-day basis is trying to like stave off the reality of death. And we're not part of the process generally, especially in the Western world. Like somebody dies, we don't dress the body. We don't anoint the body for burial ourselves anymore. We don't. It was often the women in a family unit that took care of this. But, the family took care of the dead body. And so the idea that you would continue to have a connection to your ancestors, especially within strong family units and elite family units, this was centrally important, and people continue to have a relationship with those. There's a book actually that I assign that's on modernity to some extent, but I think it's relevant. It's by someone named Dan Forth. And it's about in rural Greece, how into the 20th century, you would bury the dead in a family tomb, wait for the body to decompose, then take the bones and put it into stack them together and put them into a family plot that is for everybody's bones. So you would even go back to the dead body and caretake for it. So all of that, to me, creates a different reality. Sorry, but I was just reading the other day, Ralph Waldo Emerson, a year after his first wife died, went and opened up the casket. Like that. Yeah. So nobody's quite sure why he did. That's a whole other story. But like the idea of our connection to death and dying in modernity, especially now, is very different than even 150 years ago, but especially 2,000 years ago when, the family would have anointed the body with oil. It would have sat in the house for a few days. You would have shrouded the body, had a ceremonial meal. Often they were called agape meals, love meals, in celebration of the body. You would go back and tend to the grave. There was a lot of caretaking that went on.
Thank you so much, Averos. John Macher? I apologize for butchering your name. Thank you for being a member. Where do we get the idea that Paul had bad eyesight?
I wonder if it's from the large letters. In one letter, he says that, look, I'm writing in my own hand and look how big it is, he often, I think in his letters occasionally makes references to himself as like, I'm not a very good speaker, I'm not very, so he makes those kind of references often. So there are a lot of scholars who have done work on this, who know more, who work in the area of disability studies as well. And one you're speaking to, I think this week, Candida Moss. And she recently wrote, hold on a second, there's a phone call coming in. She's written recently on this, so she might be a good scholar to ask about that as well.
Okay, I will. John, thank you for that super chat. Robert Herring with the super sticker. Thank you also for being a member of our YouTube channel. Festering Boils says, why do you think the author of Mark didn't include resurrection appearances?
That's not why I think he was writing this story. I think we talked about this another time I visited, that, the Gospel of Mark, I think we kind of miss how I think I said to you before, like esoteric it is. I think I said we should hear the Twilight Zone music when we read it. Because like Jesus is here, and then he's here, and then he's here, and then he's here. And it's just very like the whole thing is, there's a guy, William Wordy, who very early on, it's attributed to him this idea of the messianic secret in Mark. Nobody knows who he is, like somewhere around, the midpoint of Mark. I think one of the disciples is like, I think you might be, like, who is this guy? He might be the Messiah. Like, shut up. Like the whole time Jesus is like,
yeah, I love that about Mark too. The demons get it, but they don't.
Gospel. Yeah, the demons are talking to him. He's like, shut up. Like he's just the whole thing. He's kind of like a jerk. He doesn't want anybody to know who he is. He's here. He's here. He's here. It's very mysterious. So for the end to be like, and then he clarified everything by like, right. That wasn't what Mark was trying to do. I think Mark was trying to create this really like, like, who is this guy kind of mystery novel. And it didn't work very well when the text became part of canon and was trying to be used to, like describe the beginnings of like Christianity and the historical Jesus.
Do you think Dennis MacDonald might be onto something when he says like when Odysseus comes back, he's disguised and no one is supposed to know, even the woman who anoints his feet, Eurycleia, he dies on the hill on this one. It's a really interesting thing. I'm convinced there's something to it. The Mary who comes and anoints Jesus' feet, and he says, wherever my gospel is told, let this be known far and wide, which in Greek would be like Eurycleia would means like fame far and wide and whatnot. So in the Homeric epic, here's this lady who's at Odysseus's feet, who also was the one who suckled him, when he was a child, and she recognizes her master, and he's like, actually he's like covers her mouth and tells her shut up or something, like really rude language, but then he's like, they're gonna kill me. Do you think there might be some?
Sure, yeah, because this is these are the kind of literary illusions that I'm interested in recreating. And there is an argument to be made that one of the motivations of the gospel authors is to kind of create a founding narrative too for this emerging movement, to whatever extent they're a part of it. Right. So, I've never denied that there may be some oral stories that these authors know, or that they know some other Christians, or Christ followers at the time. It would be really weird if they were writing it and didn't know any. Right. Yeah. But it just, what I argue against in that first book is, to what extent is it like the oral tradition of the community? That's the thing that I find, not as convincing for what you're pointing out here. Because it looks a lot more like what you're seeing from Homer, from Virgil. You can see these other allusions that are not just exclusive to, say, like the Hebrew Bible.
Get the book. Get the book. Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for that festering. Eric Johnson, why don't the Gospels quote Paul?
Oh, like Paul? Well, because it's set before Paul. So
they're purposely avoiding that, maybe?
No, but I think he's in it. There are actually a few, the book that you just pointed out, I start with a story about, that's the one, about this scholar in the 19th century named Gustav Volkmar, who was ostracized for arguing that the entire characterization of Jesus in the Gospels was based on Paul, that there just wasn't enough information about the historical Jesus. So Paul's teachings, again, like the ethical principles he lays out, his interest in Greco-Roman philosophy, things like the Last Supper that he describes as a divination experience, were all taken by the gospel authors, coupled with what we were just talking about. What do you do when you're writing a Greek novel or a foundational epic? Like what are the literary strategies of the day that, like an empty tomb, that symbolize, engagement with high literate culture? So taking those two elements and putting them together. So, as an ancient author writing within a particular genre, they're not there to document, it seems like it is to us because we're using these texts for another purpose, right? But if you're, using Paul and you're referencing the Last Supper, to my mind, you're quoting Paul.
That's what, one question in this, you're making me think of it, Eric. Thank you for the wonderful question.
Yeah, it's a great question.
It really is, because it makes me think, all right, if Jesus is created in the image of Paul, would this also explain why Jesus never has a wife? I mean,
what philosopher ever talks about one? I mean,
I don't know. I'm just thinking, like maybe Paul's like.
This is an argument about like Aristotle, right? Like he argued that women have fewer teeth than men, like when he was talking about like, you know, women's physiology, and everyone's like, didn't he just ask Mrs. Aristotle? Like what, right? Like now there's some other, you know, like sexual politics going on in the ancient world here that I'm sort of aligning, but
Right.
yeah, you know, like one wonders where those lines are with it, with this kind of thing. Sorry, that's kind of like
You're
but
fine.
most philosophers don't, you know, like you can't be spending your whole time talking about like, you know, denying the passions, etc. I mean, Paul talks about marriage. It actually kind of does seem like there was a Mrs. Paul somewhere. You know, he does say like, but he said maybe at some time, but he does say like, you know, it's better to be like me. Like, check me out. I'm not married. Like, it's not a problem for me. Like, my
Right.
passions are under control. If you can't handle it, then get married, right? But like the true philosopher, like the true wise man, just doesn't
That's
go
what he's
there.
aiming for. Okay. Thank you
Yeah,
so
and
much.
so Jesus doesn't go there either, and neither did Aristotle. Or he would have asked Mrs. Aristotle about her too.
Thank you. We got a couple more, and then I'll let you go. I know we've hung around 90 minutes, so our timing is pretty good. Doc Pluralmanat, thank you again for the super chat. Paul curiously says he is of the tribe of Benjamin. How does this make sense as a term of identity, as these affiliations had long been defunct? Self-promoting historical pugnance. What's this? Pugnacious
Street cred. So yeah, that's one of the few things he says. If I'm correct, and you should double check me, you know, I could be missing something, but I think he only brings that up when he's talking about his competitors. And so he brings it up when he's like, you know, what's my pedigree? Well, I'm a Pharisee. I'm from the tribe of Benjamin. Like, I know my shit. Like, that's
Right.
basically. And the idea that these would not be operational categories, I think the problem with that is that may be kind of like a later rabbinic retrospection on, like, you know, Judaism, like the history of Judaism in this period, to be honest. And again, this could be idiosyncratic to me, but we don't know a ton about what it meant to be a Pharisee out, you know, in this period. We don't know a ton about what it meant to be a Pharisee outside of Judea in this period. We don't know a lot about the education of a Pharisee like Paul in this period, other than what, again, his letters display in terms of, like, he's a better letter writer than most. He's clearly a native Greek speaker who knows Greco-Roman philosophy, right? So we can draw a bunch of conclusions from that. And so as a part of that, for him to kind of to put this forward as part of his, again, like a search for authority, it must have meant something. Mm-hmm. And even if it was like a little bit nebulous to those who heard it, it certainly was establishing him as having some kind of like legitimate pedigree to the kind of claims that he was making, beyond, you know, the idea that he's a Pharisee and interpreter of scripture. So I think it is an affiliation that is serving a purpose. It has a strategic purpose for him, and seems to have meaning when he uses it.
Thank you so much for that answer, Doc. Thanks for that super chat. Avro says, did Paul believe Jesus was pre-existing divine being, a God angel, a la Philippians 2:6-7, also 1 Corinthians 10:4? Would James, etc., come to believe the same?
Yeah, we talked about this a little bit. Thanks for the question. I think it's possible. This comes back to this idea of, like, you know, when did he become the Son of God? I think that I would have to look at those passages again, you know, just to really analyze it in a deep way. But the idea that Jesus was kind of predestined or designated for this particular role in the history of mankind or humankind, that makes sense to me, as something that would square with Paul's strategies about God's work in human history. Do you see what I mean? Like, that God predetermines these roles. So again, like, Paul thinks that he was predetermined to have this role. And so that works in that respect. I'm much more interested personally in how he thinks this is all going to square at the end. Because once Jesus is resurrected, has that pneumatic body, I mean, the language is very militaristic. This idea that he's going to come with an angelic army. So I'm kind of segueing to something I'm working on right now, which is through Paul, especially in First Corinthians, how he's describing basically this kind of end time fight with a bunch of angels, how it's going to work. And there was this idea that there are these kind of, what was the term, like divine beings that existed. Sometimes the term used is something like daimons, but these intermediate beings, divine beings. And usually from the Greek and Roman philosophers to Paul, they're described as existing in this region that's below the moon, so somewhere between the earth and the moon. And the moon in both Greek, Roman, and even to some extent Jewish imagination is understood as kind of like a clearinghouse for souls. And so there's this region between the earth and the moon, which is also where it seems, based on some of the language that Paul uses about like the ether and the pneuma and like actually just kind of the pragmatic sort of physics of the whole thing that he describes. Like it's coming primarily, I think, from his knowledge of Stoicism in this period. There do seem to be these ideas, and there's a woman named Karen O'Malley who's written on this. She wrote a book called The Moon in Greek and Roman Imagination, which I can't recommend more. It's
Oh
like
gosh, I got to write this down.
And that's where some of this is coming from.
My wife's going to kill me. I've been buying too many books.
I know, and it's a Cambridge book too, but I think it's in paperback now.
Okay, I'll have to get it to you afterward. Afterwards, I got to get that. I'll add it to the description or something.
This book, The Moon in Greek and Roman Imagination, talks about all of this kind of, phenomenologically through the ancient Mediterranean. But that region below the moon, between the earth and the moon, that's where these kind of divine spirits and daimons live. And it seems to me, and so this is again something I'm working on right now, that Paul understands this, he engages this, and thinks that both, this resurrected Jesus and his divine army are kind of like waiting. This is why I referenced Bowie. It's very much like, Starman waiting in the sky, he's going to come down with his divine army and tackle this, this whole problem of the archons of the age. So I think that kind of idea that there are these spirits, pre-existing divine beings like that's totally operational, and I could see that.
Oh my gosh, thank you for that question. Thank you for ranting on that. Like I know that it's like we're at the end of the hour. I feel bad for everybody who has not tuned in to watch this. I'm sorry. Anyone who's into this kind of material, they were not on the front row seats actually listening to this. I'm sorry, you did not get to witness this. Where we have a metaphorical lighter, and we're just, this is amazing, this is awesome. Like, I love this, I really do. Thank you for your time. Scott Duke says, what reference talks about the ecclesia outside of the Bible?
Like a gajillion. So
it's a Greek term. So yeah,
I would look into the book I referenced before, John Kloppenborg's Christ Associations. He goes through inscriptions and, papyri that's documented this. And, if we're talking about literary references, they're out there. John has, this book is a doorstop. It's, I reviewed it at SBL last November. It's really it's one of those kinds of, you look at it and you're just like, oh God, only a scholar who with as many years as he has had, acquiring this knowledge and these sources could put something like this together. It's a real service to the field, and it goes through a lot of these examples.
Yeah, and I've heard that before as well. So I added the moon. I just called it the Moon Book. It's in the description. It's in my Amazon recommended list for MythVision books. There's a lot of books in there. So
yeah, her name. She's Irish, and so the spelling of O'Malley is Nima. That's the one. Yeah. So even though excellent book.
So that's something to work off of, because we are going to be wanting to read yours, or at least the chapter that you're going to be, or article, whatever you publish.
There is a chapter and an article. They're on their way. So these things take a little while, but it's written, so it'll be out soon.
Well, they have plenty of work they can get into right here that even deals with a lot of the things we're talking about today in Paul, but how the Gospels, what's up with the Gospels. In fact, to tease our audience, there will be an upcoming debate / discussion. I don't know how we want to organize it, but keep in mind on my channel, everything is extremely formal and respectable. I'm not into Jerry Springer fights and stuff. My dad watched that growing up. I never really cared for it much, but professional disagreements and discussions where my buddy, Jonathan Sheffield, who I love to death, he's a wonderful Christian buddy of mine. He thinks that the gospel authors are the disciples, or at least the more traditional approach, right? And you might be coming on, fingers crossed, to have that kind of conversation. And let's see what happens in the evidence of what can we know, right? How can we base it on the evidence? Go get her book if you want salvation, right? I'm literally offering you salvation for her book. Like, you go buy it, you will cleanse yourself. It's like baptism, but better. Gotta get it.
Try.
Seriously, though, I do have a few more super chats that slid in. Can we get these real fast?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Totally
Okay.
Fine.
Abaros.
No
again,
text. I just checked. No text from daycare. Everybody's good.
That's always a good thing. I always try to.
Yeah,
respect
it's
your
raining,
time.
but I haven't seen any tornadoes. We're good.
You're still alive.
Yeah.
Abaros' messianic secret in Mark is about keeping the nature and function of Jesus, sacrificial Son of Man, hidden from heavenly powers, or they will not kill him, thwarting God's plan of redemption as per 2 Corinthians.
Yeah, often it's described as a strategy of the text that, the second he's revealed, he will be crucified, and he's trying to delay that. Some people also talk about, back to this idea of pathos, that, Jesus seems to be, I think sometimes the term used as reluctant Messiah. Like, he knows what's coming and he's like, oh, okay, he doesn't want to do it. And basically, after that midpoint where he's revealed, then, some people describe Mark as sort of like a long death march with like a little preface to it. Because it starts with his baptism, and basically he's on his way to Jerusalem the entire time to kind of fulfill this thing that he knows he needs to fulfill. So yeah, the spirits know him, the demonic spirits, but also whenever he heals somebody, with the exception of the hemorrhaging woman, I think, in Mark 5, but generally speaking, when he heals people in Mark, the word in Greek is basically like bad pneuma. So there's bad pneuma in people that talk to him, and his good pneuma, or sometimes dunamis, his power, is what can displace that bad pneuma. And so as he goes through the text, that's how he's actually performing his miracles, especially the healing miracles, is he's replacing the bad pneuma with good, or talking to it. So non-human entities can recognize him and speak to him, and it demonstrates his divine status, or his spiritual status in the text. And so but once the earthly figures begin to acknowledge who he is, earthly rulers recognize who he is, whether we're talking about, like Jewish authorities or Roman authorities. Once that's recognized, that's when he gets himself into some trouble. So yeah, the messianic secret is about keeping his status, his supernatural. I don't like to use supernatural because it's all natural. It's all part of like the natural world.
Right.
But keeping that special status kind of under wraps, because people aren't going to understand it. The other theological question that sometimes comes up with this is basically like, does he want to do this like in the first place? You know what I mean? Like that,
Mm-hmm.
that becomes a major factor. And then you get some later traditions, things like Docetism, that are trying to figure out, like, well, was he really a real person the whole time? Was he spiritual? You know what I mean? Like those issues start to come up too, in a kind of similar vein to trying to figure out, his nature and purpose.
Interesting question, and well put on the response. It makes me think of this idea of mythicism, just to make a comment, where they talk about these the archons of this age, that they will argue these aren't human entities, they're all demons or some type of spiritual entities, right? But in Mark, the spiritual entities, if I could use the term, recognize Jesus. So it's like,
yeah.
So my question is like, I mean, I guess there's always a way to wiggle out of this, but like for me, it's like the humans seem to not get who he is, but even the spiritual demons do.
Well,
so
that's kind of the point. Like the earthly archons and earthly beings can't conceptualize this power of who he is, right? Like they can't, because once they recognize that he is powerful, divine, again, dunamis, the word in Greek is the word that's used, that he is powerful, Son of God, predicted Messiah, all those, whatever term you want to use. Once they realize that, like, they want to tap it down, they don't understand it. And so he's sort of functioning on that plane of, like, he can talk to spirits, he can talk to the powers, to the things that are beyond human comprehension. And because, the human beings are generally afraid. So the other theological question that comes up with this is, like, how much is this, again, predetermined, right? Like, he seems to be aware that the second I reveal who I am, I know what's going to happen. Human beings can't handle this, like the archons of this age can't handle this, meaning the human beings who are in a ruling position will not tolerate, him taking over some kind of authority. And so the authorities of the age are going to kill him. But that's so this is what, actually, back to Paul, is what he talks about in terms of not only having seen the resurrected Jesus as proof of the end of this age, the coming new age, that these archons of the age will be defeated by the coming Messiah. Part of that is that he describes it as Jesus's faithfulness in that plan is what made this all possible. That he had his faithfulness. Often that gets translated, actually, it's the difference. This is Stanley Stauer's work as well. It's the difference between a subjective and objective genitive in Greek. So is he the subject or the object of the faith, Jesus? And often in English, in our Bibles in English today, regardless of translation, it's often described as faith in Jesus is the reason all of this took place. That is not what the Greek says. The Greek actually says it's Jesus's faithfulness that made this all possible. And we know this because whenever Paul talks about Moses's faithfulness, Abraham's faithfulness, any other prophet's faithfulness, any other Jewish figure, it's always the faithfulness of that Jewish figure ushered in that new age, that kind of progression of history. And now it's Jesus's faithfulness that this whole predicted plan of the crucifixion, resurrection will bring into place this new age. It's Jesus's faithfulness in that plan that's made this all possible. And then Paul's own faithfulness and God's plan to, graft in the Gentiles back into the family tree of Abraham is part of it too. But it's Jesus's faithfulness in this plan. And so what Mark does is demonstrate that it's Jesus's commitment to the plan, even if he's a reluctant Messiah, even if there's a messianic secret, however you want to describe what you see as that conflict. In Mark, it squares with Paul in that, there's a faithfulness to that plan. And even if he didn't like it, like he did it. And he goes along with it, but he knew what would happen once he revealed who he was.
Thank you. Wow, we could go. There's so much here. Can she explain the kick the goads? Paul took it. I think it's that. And thank you for the super chat. I think it's the idea.
Sorry that my answer was I don't know what the goads.
So in Acts, it's hard to kick against the goads. I found this in Euripides' Bacchae as well.
You answer because you know more than I do then.
No, I do not. Far from it. I just have heard this specifically from some of the other academics who looked at this and they said, hold on, in Acts, Paul uses the same phrase. Now, someone might come along and say it's just a common phrase used in the Greco-Roman world. People have used it because they've been influenced by Euripides' Bacchae play. The other idea is we're dealing with text, just like you're talking about with the Gospels. And here's someone looking at text and going, well, let's see. Dionysus was a son of God. If you didn't recognize him as a son of God, punishment was going to come. Okay. There seems to be a common trope and maybe a literary trope in having Paul say hard to kick against the goads. Plus they also say, just a fun fact that I thought was interesting, when Paul gets converted in Acts 9, or if we can call it that, he has the experience. Let's not use conversion because I know Paula Fredrickson hates.
You could use conversion, like turning.
Okay,
right. From one to the other. Yeah.
But that idea that he is blinded and there's a bright light and he can only, Jesus is the one who says, hey, why do you persecute me? Paul, or Saul, why do you pursue me? Which is actually a reference to 1 Samuel where David is running from Saul. And he says, Saul, Saul, why do you pursue me? Same Greek word for persecute. The flashing light where he blinds him is, who is the uncle of Dionysus in that play that doesn't recognize him, but he goes out to the Maenads?
Oh, I don't know. You'd have to, not off the top of my head.
I don't
Sorry.
remember. No, it's fine. I can't remember his uncle's name. Are you hearing a noise? I feel like I hear something. Maybe I'm listening to you.
I think you might be having an experience.
I'm having an experience. In fact, it's actually your lecture that just turned on from the one you emailed me. I'm like, I'm hearing you, and I'm like, but you're not saying anything. Anyway, someone might notice in the chat the name. Point is, he has a blinding light while he's hiding in the tree looking at the Maenads, and Dionysus blinds him, and then they shred him apart, and they like take him, put his head on a pike, and go back in the city. Jesus shows mercy where Dionysus actually condemns him. So anyway, we're sidetracked.
But this idea that there has to be some kind of physical change that takes place as well, and that kind of turning, that's not unusual either. To symbolize some kind of engagement with the primary deity.
Right.
So yeah, whether it's something communicated through literary strategy or a literary strategy in and of itself, that's not uncommon.
Wow. Well, thank you so much. This has been a blast. We've caught up. I thank everyone for your super chats, your support. Please go get her book. Let me pop this up here. Please go get The Origins of Early Christian Literature. I'm looking forward to your updated On the Moon with Paul and all of that. You teased
I'll
us
come
quite
back,
well.
when that comes out, and then I'm hoping to finish the second book actually over the summer. So hopefully we'll have more to talk about coming up.
Same here. I'm working on editing a bunch of stuff right now that will end up on Patreon sometime soon. Every month there's a drop off for whatever reason. People at the end of the month don't have their payment plan set up, where they just wanted to come and watch what they could. I could use some help. So to keep MythVision going, I appreciate everybody who does join it or become a member of the YouTube channel, just to help me keep doing what I'm doing and bringing the scholars that I am. And don't forget the Passion Translation today. This guy really did have Jesus come and blow on him. And I didn't even get far into that. But seriously, is there any final words you want to say to our audience? How can we help support? What can we do?
Oh no, just I'm always happy to come here and talk about any of these materials. I always try to be careful about what I know, so I don't mean to be disappointing because I'm not as like salacious I think as some guests could be, but I'm always happy to convey what I know, and I always learn a lot actually about what I don't know, but also put on the spot. I was thinking it's almost like having an exam a little bit. Like when I come here, what exactly do I know off the top of my head? So it's always, I think, or I hope, mutually beneficial. So I'm always happy to be here, and always appreciative of what you put together for helping make these connections with the public.
I hope everybody in the chat will get on her, because I've been telling her to do a Patreon, and she has a lot of courses that she technically could, get the help to help with her family and her child and stuff like that. Your husband would appreciate it, I'm sure too, but seriously, we got to get you a Patreon. And then occasionally when you have the time, you can go check messages, whatever, and say hey to fans or answer questions, whatever. But yeah, I'm working on that. I'm trying. We will have you back, hopefully, to do the discussion/debate, however we want to formulate that, on who wrote the Gospels. And thank you for your time. Never forget, ladies and gentlemen, never forget, we are MythVision.